Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something juicy, literally and historically. You ever think medieval kings were just dusty old guys in armour? Think again, some of them were freaks, power, isolation, unchecked egos, and an endless supply of wine. Yeah, that's the perfect recipe for behaviour so unhinged, you'd need a historian, a therapist, and maybe an exorcist to explain it. But you probably won't survive this. Not because it's gory, though sometimes it is, but because once you peek behind the curtain of velvet robes and royal thrones, it's hard to unsee what was going on in those torchlit bedchambers. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment with your city and what time it is where you're listening. I always love seeing where you all are tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. We start in the warm golden glow of 10th century Al-Andalus, where the most powerful man in Iberia, Caliph Al-Hakam II, is lounging on a silk-draped chaise, surrounded by manuscripts, poets, and possibly more nude statues than the Vatican after hours. His reign in Cordoba is remembered for scholarship, art and architecture, sure, but what often gets left out of the textbooks is his extremely curated private collection of erotic literature. Think of it as a medieval porn hub, but in scroll form and with better calligraphy. Al-Hakam wasn't some slobbering creep though. The man was a legitimate intellectual. He expanded the royal library to include over 400,000 volumes, a staggering number for the time, and among them were thousands of works dedicated to sex, desire, and sensual philosophy. Not just for fun either. He treated eroticism as a science, something to understand, control, and, well, indulge in, obviously. And it wasn't just Arabic texts. He was a collector of Sanskrit, Greek, and Persian erotica too, multilingual kink. Now here's where things get a little murky and a little spicy. Rumour had it that Al-Hakam was particularly fond of young men, specifically one beautiful page named Jafar al-Mushafi, whom he kept very close, like unnervingly close. So close, in fact, that when Al-Hakam was urged by his court to marry and produce an heir, he was like, fine, but only if I get to marry Jafar in disguise. So supposedly, Jafar donned women's clothes, took the name Sub, and was installed as the Caliph's official consort. They even had children, though scholars debate whether Sub was actually female all along, or if this was an elaborate ruse that fooled no one but the court historians. It's one of those weird spots in history where records exist but motives are lost. Was it progressive gender bending, strategic misdirection, or just a desperate attempt to let the Caliph keep his lover by pretending to play by the rules? Either way, the poetry from that period was steamy. Lots of soft verses about tangled limbs, dark eyes, and the scent of musk in the folds of night. Makes you wonder what bedtime stories they were telling. Now, for your quirky tidbit, Al-Hakam's library included a whole wing for erotic medicine, complete with diagrams of intimate positions and herbs meant to increase stamina. There were even instructions for love spells, aphrodisiacs, and performance potions, many of which he personally tested on his favourite companions. So yes, the world's first Viagra trial may have happened under a mosaic dome in Cordoba, but not everyone appreciated this sensual empire. After Al-Hakam's death, puritanical advisors to his son Hisham reportedly burned many of the erotic texts in the library. Thousands of works just gone, reduced to ash. Some say it was a moral crusade, others claim it was political, a way to wipe out reminders of the old regime and its more fleshy priorities. But the debate lingers. Were they cleansing corruption or destroying culture? That's the thing with these medieval scandals. You never know if it's a kink, a cover-up, or both. And here's a reality check. Al-Hakam wasn't unique. He was just rich enough and literate enough to leave a paper trail. Imagine how many other kings and caliphs were indulging in similar pleasures, just without a scribe to document the nightly routines. If the tapestries could talk, right? Still, Al-Hakam's court was a rare hybrid of decadence and discipline. One minute you're commissioning a 12-volume medical encyclopedia, the next you're asking your astrologer which hour is best for, well, mutual inspiration. And while his palace walls were lined with scholars, poets and clerics, they were also echoing with the quiet rustle of silk robes at midnight and the occasional giggle behind heavy doors. There's something almost cinematic about his world. The moonlight streaming in through lattice windows casting patterns on bare skin. the scent of jasmine and clove drifting through the halls, a flute playing somewhere in the background, while a debate about Aristotle segues smoothly into a night of indulgence. And so that's where we begin, not with a sword or a crown or a war, but with a man who ruled through pleasure as much as power, who believed that knowledge of the body was just as sacred as knowledge of the stars, who made sure that while history might remember his reign for architecture, those who look closer will always find the pages sticking together. Now let's drift northwest, across the Pyrenees, and into the foggy chaos of medieval France, where King Charles VI is having a moment. A long, disturbed, and frankly uncomfortable moment that lasts for most of his reign. Charles wasn't just a king, he was a walking tragedy in silk hose. Known as Charles the Mad, he started out as a hopeful young monarch, but ended up spending a good portion of his adult life believing he was made of glass, running naked through the halls, and occasionally forgetting who he was, which makes for some wild bedtime stories and even wilder palace intrigue. But before the glass delusion and the screaming fits, Charles had one thing on his mind: pleasure. His court in Paris became a hotbed of masked balls, erotic theatre, and strange rituals that teetered somewhere between religious ecstasy and an extremely sweaty fever dream. And the king? He wasn't watching from the sidelines. He was in the middle of it all, dancing, whispering, and more often than not, losing himself in some disturbingly elaborate roleplay. The most infamous of these spectacles was the Bal des Ardents, or the Ball of the Burning Men. Charles, along with a group of nobles, decided to dress up as wild men, basically medieval Tarzans, and cover themselves in flammable resin, feathers, and flax to imitate forest creatures. Cute, right? Except someone brought a torch too close, and half the group went up in flames like marshmallows on a bonfire. One of the men died screaming. Another spent months bandaged like a mummy. Charles barely survived, saved only because his mistress, the Duchess of Berry, tackled him and smothered the flames with her skirts. Romance, medieval style. But here's the thing, this wasn't a one-off. Charles's court had a recurring obsession with costumes, transformation, and sexually ambiguous pageantry. Behind the silken veils and flowing wine was a deep fixation on sensual escape. These parties weren't just social events, they were rehearsals for something bigger. The idea was simple: strip off identity, become someone or something else for the night, and indulge. This was medieval kink disguised as nobility. And Charles? He was its muse. When the madness really began to kick in, sometime after he killed 4 of his knights in a random outburst, his taste didn't exactly calm down. In fact, his court became more insular, more unhinged. Erotic plays were performed with little concern for subtlety. Courtiers wore gender-fluid costumes. It was not uncommon to see noblemen prancing through the palace in silk chemises, while ladies played knights in mock jousts that, rumour has it, often ended in less than chaste arrangements behind tapestries. The Duke of Orleans, Charles's younger brother, didn't help matters. He was said to be deeply involved in these strange courtly games, and may have even encouraged Charles's more erotic fantasies, both for fun and for power. Some whispered that Orleans had a bit too much influence over the king, a bit too much physical closeness. Was it brotherly affection or something more? Scholars debate this, and the sources are frustratingly vague, like someone burned all the good gossip just before the printing press showed up. One odd historical footnote: Charles kept a private menagerie, not just of animals, but of costumed servants who played out his dreams like actors in a recurring play. Each had a role: a faun, a martyr, a seductress, a demon. They rotated nightly, dressing and undressing according to scripts scrawled in gold ink. He called it his chamber theatre. His advisors called it a political catastrophe. Guess which one he listened to. And here's your quirky tidbit. Charles had a favourite horse, not that kind of favourite, calm down, that he dressed in royal robes and referred to as a duke. No joke. He made his servants bow to it. Occasionally, he even had it judge poetry contests in the court. It won't surprise you that those who lost often found themselves reassigned to less cushy posts, far from the candlelit ecstasies of the palace. Eventually, the French court couldn't take it anymore. With Charles flitting between madness and masked sensualism, the nobles started scheming. They blamed his wife, Isabeau of Bavaria, who had her own set of rumours trailing her like an expensive train. Some claimed she took lovers by the dozen. Others said she ran a secret cabal of seduction that used pleasure to manipulate politics. But the real drama centred on Charles himself, this sad, fragile figure crumbling under the weight of his fantasies and his crown. There's still debate among historians about the root of Charles's madness. Was it hereditary? Did he suffer from schizophrenia, poison, syphilis, mercury treatments gone wrong? It's one of those historical puzzles we'll never fully solve. But what's clear is that the eroticism of his court wasn't just about fun. It was about power, escape, and identity. It was about losing yourself in a world of masks, silk and flame, when the real world became too unbearable to face. One historian even called Charles's reign a long, luxurious suicide. Not because of war or plague, but because of the way his court twisted pleasure into a kind of soft death. You partied, you danced, you whispered in candlelight, and eventually everything else, loyalty, governance, sanity, burned away. And that's the real tragedy. Beneath all the silks and scandals, Charles was a man who cracked. And instead of healing, he built a fantasy world where he could pretend to be whole again, even if just for a night. Let's take a foggy walk across the English Channel now, into the heart of late 14th century England, where King Richard II is pacing the stone corridors of Westminster, draped in robes that shimmer with golden thread and embroidered pomegranates. He's young, he's dramatic, and he's about to make the entire kingdom raise its collective eyebrow. Not for war, not for economic reform, but for one man, Robert de Vere. Or as court gossip liked to say, his royal favourite. Now, favourites weren't unusual in medieval courts. Kings had confidants, advisors, drinking buddies, and the occasional secret companion. But Richard's relationship with de Vere? Oh, it broke all the subtlety rules. This wasn't just a bromance. It was a court-consuming obsession that flared with such intensity that nobles began counting how many nights de Vere spent in the royal chambers, and how many times Richard ignored his actual wife to whisper into de Vere's ear instead. Robert de Vere was handsome, charming, and just dangerous enough to be fascinating. He had the kind of cheekbones that probably inspired troubadours to write emotionally confusing songs. Richard elevated him to the title of Duke of Ireland, basically out of nowhere, and poured lands, honours, and treasure on him like a lovesick lottery winner. Even Parliament, which usually didn't care about royal crushes, started muttering about the unmanly affection between king and favourite. And the court? Oh, it buzzed. Nobles fumed while poets quietly scribbled. Women rolled their eyes. Men sharpened their daggers. The Queen, poor Anne of Bohemia, was mostly silent. But her absence from many public events said more than any scandal sheet could. Now, before you start imagining candlelit poetry readings and shared goblets of wine, remember this is medieval England. People didn't write down, "The king is absolutely doing this guy" in the official records. But they did hint. Chroniclers talked about indecent intimacy. They mentioned how Richard refused to be separated from de Vere, even when it made his council furious. And the most telling detail, de Vere built a special private retreat in Oxfordshire, rumoured to be used exclusively for their time together. It was surrounded by high walls, hidden gardens, and fountains shaped like, well, let's just say not your average cherub. One fringe theory, floated by more than a few speculative historians, is that this wasn't just about love or lust, it was about escape. Richard had come to the throne young, during a time of rebellion and plague. The peasants' revolt had shaken him to his core. Some say de Vere was more than a favourite. He was a coping mechanism, a human shield from a world that demanded too much too fast. Others argue Richard was modelling his court on older, more luxurious traditions, Byzantine perhaps, where emperors kept male favourites as part of divine right and mystery. Whatever the truth, Richard's devotion blinded him to the politics swirling around him like a storm. His barons grew restless. They hated de Vere, hated his arrogance, his rapid rise, his suspicious influence. So they plotted. In 1387, they cornered him with an army. De Vere fled, Richard tried to rally support, but the tide had turned. The Lords Appellant, basically the "we've had enough of this nonsense" faction, forced de Vere into exile and Richard into humiliating submission. Here's your historical fun fact. De Vere tried to stage a dramatic comeback by sneaking into England from the continent. But his fleet ran into a literal fog bank, and his forces were routed. He ended up living out his days in a kind of royal purgatory, wandering between France and the Low Countries, reportedly mourning both his lost power and his lost king. Richard never got over it. Some say he kept de Vere's letters in a hidden drawer. Others claim he wore a ring the man gave him until the day he died. And when Richard finally cracked, declaring himself semi-divine, demanding absolute loyalty, and imprisoning nobles who questioned him, many saw it as the long shadow of heartbreak. A king scorned, still trying to rewrite history as a love story gone wrong. Now here's the quirky detail for this round. During Richard's reign, there was a weird uptick in court fashion involving close-fitting tunics with absurdly long sleeves, some dragging behind the wearer several feet. They were called devil's sleeves, and critics said they symbolised vanity and decadence. But some fashion historians believe they were inspired by de Vere's personal wardrobe, which means the whole court was literally dressing like the king's crush, even as they secretly plotted to destroy him. The open debate here is whether Richard and de Vere were truly lovers, or if their relationship was just emotionally codependent and politically disastrous. Some scholars argue that Richard was asexual, preferring art and intimacy over physicality. Others think the scandal was exaggerated by enemies, weaponized as propaganda. But one thing's clear: their bond was intense, obsessive, and ultimately the crack in the foundation of Richard's fragile monarchy. And that fragility? It didn't end well. Years later, Henry Bolingbroke, future Henry IV, usurped the throne. Richard was deposed, imprisoned, and quietly murdered. Some say his last days were spent scribbling poetry in the Tower of London, writing verses about betrayal, about loss, and about a world that had no room for the kind of love he had tried so desperately to keep sacred. So if you ever wonder how far a king might go for the one person who made him feel seen, well, in Richard's case, it was all the way to exile, deposition, and death. For a man who ruled with silks and sighs rather than steel and swords, his heart was always his crown, and both were far too easy to steal. Time to darken the mood a little, because now you're riding east into the thick forests and jagged peaks of 15th century Wallachia, where one man's idea of fun involved more stakes than a Vegas poker table. You probably know him by his nickname, Vlad the Impaler, or, if you're feeling spooky, Vlad Dracula. And yes, the guy was terrifying in battle, but what rarely gets mentioned is just how perverted his cruelty could get, especially behind castle doors. This wasn't just about war. This was about control, sadism, and a deeply unsettling fusion of sex and death that turned his court into a psychological minefield. Picture this: a stone hall illuminated by torchlight, shadows flickering along blood-red tapestries. Vlad, sitting high on his throne, not with a goblet, but with a sharpened wooden stake at his feet, polished to a point so fine it could slide between ribs. Now, this is not your average medieval punishment tool. This was art to Vlad. He once said that he enjoyed watching his enemies writhe like worms, and he didn't mean that metaphorically. But here's the real twist. Some of his victims weren't criminals or political enemies. They were his own mistresses, lovers and servants, killed not just for betrayal, but because he enjoyed watching power twist into agony. There's a story, maybe more legend than fact, but too juicy to ignore, about a young woman Vlad took as a lover. She apparently questioned whether he had feelings for her or merely used her as a plaything. Mistake number one. He responded by inviting her to a special dinner. She arrived dressed in silk, expecting roses. She got ropes instead. He tied her to a bedpost, walked around her in silence, and then calmly read scripture aloud while she screamed. Some say he impaled her afterward. Others say he let her go, only to haunt her dreams with threatening notes and symbolic gifts of birds with broken wings. It wasn't just the women either. Vlad's male lovers, or at least his more submissive courtiers, often found themselves in equally dangerous situations. His inner circle was said to be a place of unspoken rules, of pleasure given only as reward, and pain administered the moment someone failed to please him or flattered him too obviously. He didn't want sycophants. He wanted chess pieces he could knock over whenever the mood struck. And moods? Oh, he had plenty. Here's your quirky fringe fact. Vlad reportedly forced visiting envoys to remove their turbans, and when they refused, for religious reasons, he had the turbans nailed directly to their skulls. That's not just medieval brutality, that's theatrical sadism, designed not only to punish but to amuse. This man treated torture like pageantry. Now, did this cruelty have a sexual edge? That's the part scholars still argue about. Some believe Vlad had what we'd now call a paraphilia, a condition where pain and power are fused with arousal. Others think his erotic side was less about pleasure and more about ritual humiliation, especially when aimed at the beautiful, the proud, or the disobedient. In one case, he reportedly invited a nobleman's wife to his court after the noble refused to pay tribute. She was found dead days later, impaled outside her village with a sign around her neck. "My husband talks too much." And it gets darker. Vlad often combined torture with bizarre dinner parties. Imagine a banquet where the central table has a roasted pig and a still-breathing man nailed beneath it. Guests would be forced to eat, drink, and pretend it was all perfectly normal. If anyone winced, they'd be next. One of the most disturbing tales says he once had his soldiers execute prisoners slowly in the dining hall while he ate his meal, licking his fingers between courses as the dying screamed. This wasn't just cruelty, it was domination laced with voyeurism. He wanted to see you break. He wanted to know that he could mix blood and wine, and you'd still ask for another glass. There's a difference between a king punishing lawbreakers and a king orchestrating a death play with himself as both director and star. And Vlad? He had box seats to every act. And yet, here's the strange part. His own people feared him, yes, but also revered him, because under his reign, Wallachia was nearly crime-free. Thieves were impaled, liars were tortured, but common folk, they could leave gold in the street and it'd still be there the next morning. So some whispered, maybe the devil keeps us safe. Of course, other kingdoms didn't see it that way. The Hungarian court kept detailed notes of Vlad's preferences. Even the Ottoman sultans, not exactly strangers to punishment, were reportedly disturbed by what he did. There's even mention of him demanding that concubines in captured harems participate in violent spectacles, or be forced to watch. And remember, he was raised as a political hostage in the Ottoman Empire, exposed to elite courts, military strategy, and possibly darker entertainments behind silk curtains. Some historians suggest that his early exposure to power dynamics between captors and captives may have wired his psyche for the twisted rituals he'd later enact. There's still debate on whether Vlad ever had romantic love in the traditional sense. He did marry, twice actually, but both unions were highly political, and neither wife left much of a mark in the records beyond vague mentions and sudden disappearances. Some think his first wife jumped off a tower to escape the invading Ottomans. Others think she was pushed. Vlad didn't leave a diary behind, just a legend of horror. In the end, Vlad the Impaler wasn't just a warrior or a sadist. He was a king who turned the erotic into something terrifying, who blurred the line between intimacy and annihilation, who made every kiss feel like a trap and every glance a gamble. He didn't need dungeons to torture his lovers. He made the entire castle one, and for the poor souls caught in his gaze, there was no safe word, only silence. We're heading north now, way north, into the frosted halls of Bohemia, where the beer flows thick, the politics get dirty, and the king? Oh, he's got a few leather-bound surprises stashed beneath the throne. Meet Wenceslaus IV of Bohemia, not to be confused with his saintly grandfather, good King Wenceslas. No, this Wenceslaus is more like the not-so-good king, especially when it came to his private inclinations. His reign, which teetered between mild reform and total disaster, is less remembered for his royal achievements and more for the nightmarishly kinky rumours that seeped out from his fortified bedroom, and, of course, the infamous room beneath it. Wenceslaus ruled during the late 14th and early 15th centuries, a period when the Central Europe was juggling wars, church drama, and more corrupt nobles than you could stuff into a chapel. And while his contemporaries wrestled with uprisings and diplomacy, Wenceslaus was reportedly building a dungeon. But not just any dungeon. According to court whispers and one particularly unnerving 15th century chronicler, Wenceslaus had a hidden chamber beneath Prague Castle, where his carnal curiosity took centre stage. It was outfitted with manacles, racks, ropes, and a collection of bronze masks designed to force certain expressions, grimaces, moans, smiles, depending on what he wanted to see. Now, here's where it gets weird. This wasn't a space used solely for punishment or interrogation, it was used for performance. He would allegedly invite select courtiers, mistresses, and even clerics into this underground theatre, where roles were assigned, costumes distributed, and everyone expected to act their part. The scripts? Oh, they were written by Wenceslaus himself. Handwritten fantasies involving betrayal, power reversal, public shame, and elaborate scenarios where one wrong line might get you actually tortured. Did he participate? Oh yes, Wenceslaus didn't just watch, he starred. One record suggests he liked being both the judge and the criminal in mock trials that somehow always ended with him tied up and punished by mere masked figures. And when he wasn't playing the defendant, he was the executioner, robed, masked, and whispering sentences in Latin as he theatrically lashed actors across the back, sometimes with a golden whip. Gold. Because, royalty. Of course, this all blurs the lines between fact and gossip. Medieval chroniclers loved scandal, especially about kings who didn't exactly behave. But multiple independent accounts from church officials, diplomats, and his own family suggest there was something very off about Wenceslaus's idea of pleasure. His second wife, Sophia of Bavaria, reportedly avoided the castle for weeks at a time, citing spiritual illness. Some think that was polite code for, "I'm not into the Iron Maiden cosplay." Now for a deliciously bizarre detail. Wenceslaus had a pet lion that roamed freely through the castle. Not in a cage, not in a courtyard, through the castle. Some say it was a symbol of power, others suggest it was a psychological tactic. Imagine being summoned to the king's chamber to discuss policy, only to have a sleepy, half-starved lion watching you from the corner. That's not diplomacy, that's foreplay, if you're Wenceslaus. Despite his eccentric appetites, he wasn't all lust and lashes. He was also a patron of the arts and literature, and supported early humanist thinkers in Prague, but scholars debate whether his support was ideological or just another indulgence. After all, some of the books he commissioned were illustrated with very suggestive imagery, often mixing religious iconography with disturbingly erotic undertones. Saints in bondage, angels with bare chests. He once had a prayer book bound in red velvet, its margins filled not with marginalia, but with tiny sketches of naked flagellants whipping themselves in rhythm. For devotonists of the Verbush, of course. But Wenceslaus's real downfall came not from his dungeon dramas, but from his total lack of royal focus. His half-brother Sigismund, who we'll get to later, and trust me, he's no saint either, eventually declared him unfit to rule. The Holy Roman electors agreed, calling him lazy, erratic, and in one translated insult, a king too often bound to beds and beasts. Harsh, but not entirely inaccurate. Here's your quirky fringe fact for tonight. Wenceslaus had an obsession with temperature. His chamber was said to be kept at a constant sweltering heat, even in winter. He believed cold air dampened desire and dulled the senses, so he ordered giant braziers lit in every corner, covered his walls with heavy tapestries and wore layers of furs, naked underneath. He once threw a banquet where everyone was required to dine in nothing but furs. The results? Mixed reviews. There's an ongoing scholarly debate about whether Wenceslaus was mentally unstable or simply a bored aristocrat with too much power and no boundaries. Some historians point to his increasing paranoia, his sudden bursts of violence, and his withdrawal from public life as signs of untreated bipolar disorder. Others argue that he was perfectly sane, just deeply eccentric and wildly uninterested in pretending to be kingly, when he could instead be whatever he was trying to be. His reign didn't end with a bang so much as a series of awkward shuffles. He was imprisoned, then released. He tried to reclaim power, then gave up. He drank heavily. He vanished for long stretches into his chamber of rituals, and he died quietly in 1419, either from a stroke or too much wine, or both. His dungeon, sealed, his writings, mostly destroyed. But a few pages survived, lines of poetry, half legible and tinged with erotic melancholy. To be bound is to know oneself, one phrase reads. A little poetic, a little terrifying. In the end, Wenceslaus IV was a man trapped in his own theatre of power and pain, where every desire had an audience, and every pleasure was a performance. His reign may not have brought peace or prosperity, but it certainly brought something. And in the torchlit corners of Prague Castle, behind the thick velvet and iron bolts, that something was always watching, always waiting for the next act to begin. Let's sail north again, this time across the icy waters of the Baltic, and through the fog-draped archipelago that leads you into Sweden's heartland. But don't get too cozy, because you're not heading into a quiet Viking village or a noble court full of honour and tradition. You're about to enter the chaotic, wine-stained orbit of King Christian II of Denmark, who also ruled Sweden and Norway for a hot, violent minute. He's remembered for plenty of terrible things, like the Stockholm bloodbath, But what often gets skipped is how his violent purges were paired with some of the most hedonistic and frankly disturbing rituals of sexual domination ever whispered about in Northern Europe. Yeah, this guy didn't separate his sadism from his sex life. He stirred them into one steaming pot and poured it all over a terrified, confused and very naked aristocracy. Picture this. Stockholm 1520. Christian has just taken the city by storm. He's crowned king in a lavish ceremony that costs a fortune in silk, silver and ox meat. But the party doesn't stop there. Oh no, he throws a victory feast that lasts 3 full days. Guests drink until they can't stand, the tables buckle under boar and roasted swan, and the palace hums with the music of drunk nobility pretending everything is fine. Then, when the banquet's over and the candles are burning low, Christian makes his move. He locks the city gates. Literally, no one leaves Stockholm. And suddenly the mood changes. Soldiers begin rounding up Swedish nobles. The same people who drank with him the night before are dragged into the square and beheaded in batches, while the streets still smell of mulled wine. Heads roll, quite literally, and Christian watches from a balcony with a cup in hand. That's the bloodbath part. But the real horror starts after, because what follows isn't just a political purge, it's personal. Christian begins hosting smaller private gatherings, ones that never make it into the official accounts, but do show up in the scribbled letters of terrified witnesses. According to one Danish noble, these late-night affairs often involved the surviving relatives of the nobles he had executed. Young widows, orphans, servants, brought in under the pretense of offering them protection or mercy, only to find themselves forced into humiliating pageants where Christian played the part of generous saviour 1 minute and tyrannical pervert the next. He would dress his prisoners in ceremonial robes, sometimes white, sometimes deep red, and force them to perform rituals before the court. Mock weddings, false confessions, and bizarre passion plays where he played every role but God. And when the performances ended, the lights dimmed and the silk ropes came out. Christian, it seems, had a taste for theatrical domination. Some said he modelled these rituals on Old Norse fertility rites, twisting ancient tradition into something grotesque and far more personal. Here's your quirky detail for tonight. Christian kept a private chamber known among his guards as the Velvet Cage. It was hidden behind a false wall and lined with black furs and mirrors. In the centre stood a rotating platform, a literal stage, where captives were paraded, costumed and interrogated. It wasn't just about torture, it was about control, spectacle, and the sick thrill of bending people until they broke. Some guests said he made the women wear fox masks while the men wore antlers. The symbolism, vague and confusing, but probably not something you'd want to interpret while in the room. As for his relationships, complicated. His queen, Isabella of Austria, kept her distance, politically and physically, but Christian had a long-time mistress, Dyveke Sigbritsdatter, who was by all accounts intelligent, cunning, and unusually involved in court affairs. Dyveke's mother, Sigbrit, served as a kind of shadow advisor, wielding enormous power for a commoner. Christian was deeply devoted to Dyveke until she mysteriously died in 1517, possibly poisoned by nobles who saw her influence as a threat. After her death, Christian reportedly spiralled. His public cruelty escalated, his sexual habits turned more erratic, and that's when the Stockholm nightmare really began. One historical debate centres on whether Christian's descent into brutality was the product of grief or madness. Was he mourning Dyveke in the only way he knew, through reenacted punishment and forced performances, or had his inner darkness simply found the excuse it needed to emerge fully? Scholars still argue this one, with some suggesting he suffered from untreated schizophrenia, while others believe he simply had too much power and no leash. Whatever the diagnosis, Christian's rule didn't last long. The Stockholm bloodbath turned Swedish nobles against him, and by 1523 he was forced to flee. Gustav Vasa took the throne, and Christian became a fugitive king wandering across Europe begging for support. And here's the poetic part. He eventually ended up imprisoned for 27 years, ironically, in Denmark, kept in a tower, alone, with no court, no captives, no velvet cage. During those decades, Christian wrote increasingly erratic letters, full of religious imagery, sexual metaphors, and hallucinated conversations with the ghosts of the people he'd killed. One surviving letter describes a dream in which he is visited by a woman with no mouth and eyes full of smoke, who accuses him of turning the red into gold and the gold into sin. Make of that what you will. And here's your fringe fact to finish it off. Christian believed he could atone for his sins by sleeping on a bed of nails, covered in rose petals. He insisted on the petals, said they reminded him of Devika's cheeks. It's unclear whether the nails or the guilt hurt more. Either way, it didn't save him. He died in captivity in 1559, raving, writing, and utterly alone. So, if you're keeping track, one king, dozens of public executions, a velvet sex theatre, and decades of lonely confinement to think about what he'd done. Christian II didn't just conquer Sweden, he seduced it, betrayed it, and dragged it into a long, blood-drenched fever dream. And when the dream ended, only the ghost stayed behind. We're back in Iberia now, sun-soaked and palace-drenched, where you're about to meet a king who flipped the traditional script on royal romance and turned his mistress into a shadow queen. Enter Alfonso XI of Castile, a man so obsessed with one woman that he practically rewrote the rules of kingship to keep her close. Unlike some of the more sadistic kings we've explored so far, Alfonso's brand of perversion wasn't about pain or psychological games. No, his indulgence was softer, stickier, and infinitely more political. He didn't just fall in love, he surrendered to it, completely. Now here's the context. Alfonso XI ruled Castile and Leon in the early 14th century, during a time of constant war with the Moors, rival nobles, and, naturally, other Christians who didn't like sharing a peninsula. And yet, even with the weight of crusades and court politics pressing down on his shoulders, Alfonso made time, plenty of time, for Eleanor de Guzman. She wasn't a queen, she wasn't even nobility by birth, but to him she was everything. The obsession started slowly, the way royal affairs usually do. A few glances, some conveniently timed appointments. You dropped your glove, madam moment, followed by a suspiciously long walk in the gardens. But once it ignited, Alfonso stopped pretending. Eleanor wasn't hidden away in some remote villa. She was brought to court, given her own household, publicly installed in the king's personal quarters, and, get this, Alfonso literally built her a palace. Not a cottage, not a wing. A palace right in Seville, where she ruled like a queen in all but name. His real wife, Maria of Portugal, was not thrilled. Imagine being the actual Queen of Castile and finding yourself treated like a political side piece while your husband parades his mistress through your throne room like she's royalty. Maria tried everything, petitions, public shaming, even diplomacy through her Portuguese relatives. Alfonso didn't budge. He continued to father child after child with Eleanor, 10 to be exact, while largely ignoring his legitimate family. One historian described the situation as the unofficial founding of a second royal household, which is a very polite way of saying the king set up an entire kingdom within a kingdom, powered by lust and loopholes. Now for your fringe fact, Alfonso declared that no tax should ever be collected on land owned by Eleanor, forever. Not just during her lifetime, but forever. It was written into law like it was some kind of love poem with property rights. Several of their children were also given high titles and even military commands. One of them, Enrique of Trastamara, would eventually become king himself, after killing his half-brother, the legitimate heir, in a messy civil war. So yes, Alfonso's perversion didn't stay between the sheets. It reshaped the family tree and plunged Spain into decades of conflict. People began to murmur that Eleanor held him under some kind of spell, that she fed him potions, that she'd once slept with a Moorish sorcerer to gain the power of seduction. Others insisted she was simply clever, a master manipulator who understood the male ego better than any nobleman ever could. And maybe that's true. Eleanor didn't just survive at court, she thrived. She managed lands, advised the king on policy, and wore jewels meant for queens. Behind her soft eyes and flattering smiles was a woman who knew exactly how far she could push the boundaries. Still, not everyone was enchanted. The church hated her. Alfonso's nobles hated her. His own son, Pedro, the legitimate heir, really hated her. When Alfonso finally died of the Black Death in 1350, everything unravelled fast. Queen Maria, who had been sidelined and humiliated for decades, snapped into action. She had Eleanor arrested, paraded through the streets, and eventually executed, strangled in a convent by royal command. A tidy little revenge, years in the making. Here's the open debate. Was Alfonso a lovesick fool or a political mastermind? Some historians argue he used Eleanor as a kind of political tool, building a rival power base through their children, and using her to consolidate influence among lesser nobles. Others see him as a weak-willed king who let his emotions compromise the stability of his reign. But the truth probably sits somewhere in between. He was clever, but he was also deeply indulgent. He loved power, and he loved Eleanor, and he wasn't willing to sacrifice either. There's even a theory that Alfonso created a secret order of knights, entirely unofficial of course, whose sole purpose was to protect Eleanor and her children. These weren't battle-hardened crusaders though. They were described in one letter as robed attendants of the moon, sworn to secrecy and bound by a vow of personal loyalty. Whether that's true or just spicy legend, no one can say. But if you're looking for medieval romance that reads more like Game of Thrones fan fiction, this is it. Let's not forget, though, the darker side of all this. Alfonso's obsession with Eleanor meant he neglected Maria, and by extension, their son Pedro, who would grow up resentful, erratic, and extremely violent. Pedro the Cruel, as he'd later be called, inherited his father's intensity, but none of his charm. Historians believe much of Pedro's cruelty was born out of his fractured childhood, ignored by his father, hated by his half-siblings, and raised by a mother whose love felt more like righteous fury. So when Alfonso XI gave his heart, he didn't just offer up roses and kisses, he gave away the future. His devotion shattered alliances, split the royal family, and seeded the civil war that would almost destroy Castile, all because of one woman and a king who simply couldn't say no. And honestly, that's the wildest part. In an era when kings were expected to be cold, calculated, and constantly at war, Alfonso rewrote the narrative. He ruled not from the battlefield or the council chamber, but from the bedroom, and from that velvet-draped palace in Seville, history was made. One sigh, one law, one child at a time. All right, buckle up and head back across the English Channel, because things are about to get murky and just a little bit greasy, with King John of England, the guy whose entire personality could be described as, what if Prince Harry and a sewer rat had a baby but make it medieval? John ruled from 1199 to 1216, and if you've heard of him, it's probably from Robin Hood movies, where he's always portrayed as this whiny, cowardly little weasel of a monarch, which honestly isn't far off. But behind the taxation schemes, petty feuds, and losing basically all of England's land in France, John had another, much darker reputation, one that didn't make it into your high school textbooks, a serious penchant for sexual coercion, forceful indulgence, and royal bedroom behaviour that made even his worst political decisions seem polite by comparison. Now, this guy didn't flirt, he took. King John was infamous for pursuing the wives and daughters of his own nobles, not with wine and poetry, but with brute entitlement. There's this haunting rhythm to the accusations. A noble goes to court, John visits their estate a week later, and suddenly the man's wife is weeping and the husband is on a mysteriously expensive pilgrimage to Jerusalem. Subtle? Not remotely. And here's the worst part. John often used his authority to make refusal impossible. If a noblewoman resisted, her husband's lands might be seized, her father could be imprisoned, her family thrown into royal debt. John didn't seduce. He weaponized his crown and turned lust into law. One chronicler, Roger of Wendover, bless his petty little soul, described John's court as a harem made of other men's wives, where the king chose new women like a butcher choosing lambs. Dramatic, maybe, but considering that even the church started calling him the enemy of chastity, it probably wasn't far from the truth. That's right, this man was so gross, the medieval church, which, remember, was totally fine with burning heretics alive, drew the line at John's bedroom behaviour. Here's a particularly chilling example. John had a fling with the wife of one of his most loyal knights. When the knight objected, John allegedly had him imprisoned under false charges. Then, with the man locked away, John married the woman off to one of his other barons as a reward for doing nothing. She had no choice in the matter. Just another pawn moved across the board, while the king kept grinning behind his goblet. But it wasn't just about the women. John reportedly enjoyed humiliating entire families. If someone crossed him, their daughter might be summoned to court and forced to serve as a lady-in-waiting, which was code for stay in this wing of the castle until I'm bored enough to ruin you. It was psychological warfare dressed in silk. And yes, some sources suggest he kept a list of women owed to him, like taxes, often noted in the margins of more official court records. Now for your quirky fringe fact. King John once offered a noble 200 marks for the right to sleep with the noble's wife. The noble accepted. Medieval England, ladies and gentlemen. But it gets worse. John later refused to pay, so not only did he sleep with the man's wife, he stiffed him on the agreed-upon price. Sleaze and stinginess. Impressive. Open scholarly debate time. How much of this is propaganda? After all, John's reign was a mess. He was excommunicated by the Pope, lost Normandy, angered the barons, and basically got guilted into signing the Magna Carta while everyone glared at him. So maybe, just maybe, some of these scandals were exaggerated. But here's the thing. These accusations come from multiple independent sources, many of which loathed each other. When even your enemies agree you're a pervert, that's, well, probably not great. Even Queen Isabella of Angoulême, John's much younger bride, reportedly found his attentions more disturbing than romantic. She was 12, yes 12, when they married. And while child marriages were unfortunately common at the time, even by medieval standards, John's behaviour was alarming. Some accounts say he refused to wait the traditional few years before consummating. Others describe his fixation on her appearance in detail that makes your skin crawl. He reportedly referred to her as his living doll, and gave her dresses cut in ways no medieval court considered decent. We're talking scandalous shoulder exposure. Shoulders in the 1200s. Calm down, John. Eventually his unchecked appetites came back to bite him. Literally. One of his mistresses, a low-born woman named Agatha, allegedly bit him during a drunken altercation at Windsor Castle. The story goes that he laughed, tried to turn it into foreplay, and then passed out in the middle of dinner. She fled that night. The record doesn't say what happened to her after, but considering John's usual behaviour, she probably changed her name and moved as far away as possible. Now let's touch on the biggest mystery. Did his perversions affect policy? Some historians say yes. John was paranoid, easily insulted, and lashed out erratically, traits that made negotiations nearly impossible. His volatile temper and tendency to play sexual games with noble families shattered trust across the realm. Others suggest that his sex life was just one symptom of broader dysfunction, a man cracking under the weight of inherited failure and ceaseless war. But either way, it coloured everything he did. Every alliance, every decision, every rebellion he faced was, at least in part, stained by the reputation he couldn't keep in his pants. When he died in 1216, bloated, feverish, and allegedly crapping himself into the afterlife, few mourned. His tomb is modest. No grand statue, no flattering portrait, just a slab of stone with his name, because after all the betrayal, coercion, and creepy bedroom antics, even the history books couldn't be bothered to dress him up. So if you ever wonder why the barons were so eager to rise up and demand the Magna Carta, just remember, it wasn't just about taxes or land, it was about dignity, about finally saying no to a king who thought he had the right to take whatever, or whoever he wanted. And that's where revolution begins. Not always with swords, but sometimes with a whispered, "Enough." All right, time to open a truly unholy can of worms, because this next king managed to make sex, religion, and politics combust into one of the biggest medieval conspiracies ever whispered about behind monastery walls. We're talking about Philip IV of France, also known as Philip the Fair. Don't let the nickname fool you, he wasn't fair like just your charming. He was fair as in blonde-haired and ice-eyed, with the personality of a tax auditor and the soul of a guillotine. Philip reigned from 1285 to 1314, and is best remembered for kicking off the 100 Years' War, fighting the Pope, and bankrupting everyone in his path. But beneath the marble mask of royal control was a man who may have been secretly obsessed with erotic power rituals, especially those allegedly performed by the Knights Templar. Now, the Knights Templar were not your average sword-swinging holy boys. By the late 13th century, they'd become fabulously rich, politically influential, and weirdly independent from most monarchs. They answered directly to the Pope, had their own banking system, and maintained chapters across Europe. But Philip, he wasn't about to let a bunch of glorified monks with swords outshine his crown, especially when he was knee-deep in debt from constant wars and elaborate royal feasts. So, in 1307, he made his move. On Friday the 13th, yes, that Friday the 13th, Philip had hundreds of Templars arrested. He accused them not just of treason or corruption, but of something far more titillating. Secret homosexual orgies, worship of a bearded demon, and kissing each other's butts during the initiation ceremonies. Seriously, that was in the paperwork. The official charges included indecent kissing, spitting on the cross, and engaging in group acts unbefitting Christian virtue. That's medieval code for stuff too spicy to write in Latin. Now, were any of these accusations true? That's where it gets messy. Some historians believe the charges were complete fabrications, propaganda designed to destroy the Templars, seize their assets, and consolidate power under the crown. But others argue that the Templars did in fact participate in bizarre symbolic rituals that involved nudity, mockery of religious icons, and possibly physical contact meant to demonstrate loyalty through humiliation. A kind of leave your dignity at the door test, soaked in secrecy and strange pageantry. And here's where Philip's own role gets suspicious. Some chroniclers, especially ones from Italian and Spanish territories, claim that the king wasn't just exposing the Templars' rites, he was fascinated by them, obsessed even. One account mentions that Philip kept certain Templars alive longer than others, interrogating them personally, behind closed doors, over a period of weeks. What kind of questions does a king need that much time to ask? Rumours spread that Philip attempted to recreate some of the rituals with his own inner circle, stripped of religious trappings, of course, and redesigned for elite French nobles. A Templar-inspired dinner party, if you will, complete with masks, initiations, and blessings that looked suspiciously like role-played blasphemy. One letter, hidden in a church archive for centuries, refers to the king's shadow rites beneath the rose tapestry, a phrase that makes absolutely no sense unless you realise the rose tapestry hung in his most private audience chamber, where no servants were allowed, and where a Templar cross was once found stitched into the carpet. Philip's fascination with erotic ritual didn't stop there. He also cracked down hard on the beguines and begghards, semi-religious communities accused of promoting spiritual ecstasy through sensual meditation. Now that might sound like a medieval yoga retreat, but to the church, and apparently to Philip, it was dangerously close to heresy. And once again, the accusations had a familiar flavour. Secret rites, sexual transcendence, and behaviour deemed obscene in the sight of the Lord. To which Philip responded, not with pity, but with fire and chains. Here's your quirky tidbit. Philip commissioned a private confessor to write a moral guidebook just for his sons, warning them against the temptations of heretical pleasure cults. But copies of this manual were oddly illustrated with extremely detailed diagrams of forbidden acts, allegedly so the princes could recognise and avoid them. Because nothing says moral purity like annotated woodcuts of group rituals involving ropes and censers. Now, as for Philip's family, let's just say his moral compass didn't exactly pass down clean. His 3 daughters-in-law were later accused of adultery in what became known as the Tour de Nesle affair, a sex scandal that nearly shattered the Capetian dynasty. 2 of them were imprisoned. 1 lover was executed. It all came tumbling down like a poorly built altar, and many whispered that it was Philip's obsession with secret sins that somehow infected his whole family. A sort of royal karmic backlash. There's still debate about how much of Philip's crusade against perversion was genuine religious zeal versus calculated political theatre. Was he trying to purge corruption from sacred institutions, or was he simply weaponising erotic scandal to justify mass arrests and asset seizures? And if he truly believed in the Templars' guilt, then why did he spend so much time privately studying their confessions? The final irony? Philip died not long after burning the last Grand Master of the Templars at the stake in 1314. Legend says the Grand Master Jacques de Molay cursed him from the flames, declaring that Philip would soon stand before God for judgment. Within a year, Philip was dead. So was Pope Clement V. And so began the slow, weird spiral that led to the 100 Years' War and eventually the fall of the Capetian line. Whether divine punishment or poetic coincidence, it definitely makes you think twice before throwing orgy allegations around like medieval confetti. In the end, Philip the Fair may not have been swinging from chandeliers or wearing velvet hoods like some of our other monarchs, but he played a far more dangerous game, turning the erotic into a political weapon. He knew that nothing shatters an institution faster than exposing its dirtiest secrets, or inventing them wholesale. And as he watched France tremble, the church waver, and the Templars go up in smoke, he may have smiled, not out of justice, but because he'd turned sin into strategy and indulgence into empire. Now it's time to duck beneath the onion domes and thick stone walls of 16th century Russia, where the air always seems cold, the churches always seem weepy, And the Tsar? Well, he's about to read you scripture while casually committing atrocities that would make the devil ask for a timeout. Yes, we're talking about Ivan IV, better known as Ivan the Terrible. And let's be honest, that nickname is doing a lot of heavy lifting. People remember him as the man who turned Russia into a fear-powered empire, but buried beneath the statecraft and executions was a man with a disturbingly complex relationship to morality, sex, and power. And somewhere between his half-baked theology and fully-baked paranoia, he crafted a private fantasy world where the lines between sin and pleasure, punishment and piety, blurred completely. Ivan wasn't just brutal, he was religiously brutal. The guy could alternate between sobbing over his sins and personally designing new methods of torture. And that energy? It absolutely seeped into his romantic life, or what passed for romance in a palace full of spies, skulls, and unpaid choir boys. You see, Ivan didn't trust people, so naturally, he filled his bedroom with them. Let's talk about the Oprichniki, Ivan's elite secret police/private cult. These weren't just enforcers. They lived in a bizarre black-clad religious order, where they took mock monastic vows and carried out the Tsar's orders with ritualistic flair. Their homes were marked with severed dog heads and broomsticks, as if someone ran a haunted Halloween pop-up in a monastery. And these men were deeply involved in Ivan's private pleasures. They guarded his women, delivered them, and, according to some sources, helped stage elaborate morality plays that always ended in one of two ways: brutal punishment or bizarre sexual rites. Ivan was married 8 times. That's right, 8. Officially. But in between those unions were countless women, many of whom were seized from noble families, peasant villages, or enemy courts. They were brought to his private estates, especially his beloved Alexandrov Kremlin, which served as both pleasure palace and torture dungeon. The space was like his sandbox for testing loyalty, faith, and how many rules of Orthodox Christianity he could bend before the walls bled icons. According to rumours passed through terrified scribes and later historians, Ivan liked to test the chastity of his brides before marriage, or before discarding them, whichever came first. He'd stage interrogations disguised as confessions, force women to testify to their own impure thoughts, then punish or reward them depending on how entertaining the answers were. His version of foreplay, a sermon, his aftercare, exile, or, if you were lucky, just a light stoning. Now, here's your fringe fact. Ivan supposedly wrote his own bedroom Bible, a collection of handwritten scrolls interpreting Orthodox scripture in ways that conveniently justified his worst impulses. One fragment, recovered and debated for centuries, contains a passage where he equates royal marriage with divine conquest, arguing that to rule the soul one must first conquer the flesh, which is a poetic way of saying, I can do what I want in bed because God made me Tsar. Real convenient theology that. But he wasn't entirely without charm, at least on the surface. Some women at court described him as magnetic, intense, and, in his younger years, even attractive. He wrote poetry, composed music, and could recite scripture from memory. But beneath the soft robes and incense was a man ready to burn down entire cities if he got a weird look during supper. And that kind of volatility doesn't lead to healthy relationships. There's one particularly grotesque story that's been passed down through multiple contradictory sources. Ivan took a nobleman's daughter as his mistress and, after a few months, accused her of hiding impure thoughts. He locked her in a bathhouse for 3 days, visited each night to quiz her on theology, then drowned her in the tub when her answers started to stray. He held a funeral for her, attended only by priests and his personal jesters. Scholars still argue about whether this really happened or was exaggerated propaganda, but either way, it's so on brand for Ivan that it's hard to dismiss entirely. Now let's talk about one of his queens, Anastasia Romanovna, his first and reportedly only true love. She kept him grounded, and her death, whether by illness or possible poisoning, was the beginning of his long, erotic descent into madness. After her death, his relationships became shorter, crueler, more erratic. One wife was sent to a convent after 2 weeks, another was drowned. Yet another he tried to wed in secret despite already having a living wife. His court became a revolving door of terrified brides and bitter monks scribbling warnings in hidden pages. Here's your quirky detail of the night. Ivan once threw a party where all the attendees were required to dress as biblical figures. But not just any figures. They had to be the villains. He himself dressed as Herod and handed out fruit soaked in vodka. One woman came as Delilah. She disappeared before sunrise. Draw your own conclusions. And while all this seems unhinged, Ivan truly believed he was acting as God's instrument. That's what makes his sexuality so unsettling. It wasn't perversion for pleasure, it was ritual, a trial, a punishment, a demonstration of dominance cloaked in scripture and incense. Every bedroom encounter became a stage for divine judgment, with Ivan always cast as both high priest and executioner. Scholars debate whether Ivan was suffering from untreated mental illness, possibly worsened by mercury-laced medical treatments. Others think he was simply shaped by the constant betrayals and bloodshed of his youth. Remember, this is a man who watched nobles murder his mother, who grew up in a court where poison was as common as porridge. So maybe his bedroom rituals weren't just about sex, they were about control in a world where nothing else was safe. When he died in 1584, reportedly while playing chess, he left behind a country scarred by fear and a throne no one wanted to sit on without checking for traps. His rule had been a long, slow burn of paranoia, divine justification, and intimate cruelty. And his legacy? Well, some Russians still call him the father of the Tsardom. Others just call him a monster in robes. But one thing's certain, Ivan didn't see the bedroom as a place of love. He saw it as a pulpit, a battlefield, and sometimes a courtroom, where the sentence was always preordained. And pleasure? That was just a byproduct of power, sacred, corrupted, and utterly inescapable. Let's head back to Central Europe now, where the air is thick with incense and battlefield smoke, and a young king sits on a golden throne, barely grown into his armour, but already living like the poster child for a leather-clad fever dream. This is Louis II of Hungary, the last king of the Jagiellonian line. And if you haven't heard much about him, that's because his reign ended with his face in a swamp at the Battle of Mohacs. But before that rather undignified end, Louis II cultivated a court life soaked in sensuality, costume, and more than a few eyebrow-raising hobbies that made his advisors whisper and his priests sweat. Louis took the throne in 1516 at the age of 10, which meant by the time he hit 17, he had both a kingdom and zero idea what to do with it. His court, based in Buda, was a swirl of Renaissance decadence and late medieval anxiety. Art, music, imported Italian fashions, and beneath all that, a private world of fetishes that would put some modern kink communities to shame. And Louis? He didn't just dabble, he curated. Now remember, this is a time when kings were expected to be virile but chaste in public, a good Catholic, a defender of Christendom, a warrior king. Louis wore the armour, sure, but in the shadows of his palace, his interests skewed less toward gallant swordplay and more toward orchestrated moral theatre, staged erotic pageants that doubled as social experiments. Imagine a masquerade ball crossed with a psychology exam and everyone's in silk masks and bare feet. That was a Tuesday night for Louis. The most infamous of these events took place in a hidden chamber beneath the main hall, lovingly nicknamed the Furnace by palace staff, probably because it was always kept swelteringly hot and glowed red from torchlight. Inside, Louis would gather a group of carefully selected courtiers, men and women, nobles and servants alike, and give them roles to play in scenarios of betrayal, seduction, punishment, or spiritual testing. Sometimes the roles were reversed mid-scene just to see how people reacted. But here's the kicker. None of this was supposed to be sexual, officially. The king claimed these games were inspired by alchemical rituals, a fusion of science, desire, and transformation. He believed pleasure was a catalyst for revealing the soul's true nature. One of his surviving journals, rescued by a monk who probably aged 10 years reading it, describes the body as a vessel of divine contradiction and speaks of ecstasy as a ladder to God. He may have failed at war, but he would have nailed a TED talk on 16th century kink theology. Louis also had a thing for leather. No, not just boots or belts. We're talking entire garments. Robes, masks, gloves, designed from dark, polished hides that he claimed symbolized resilience and control. Guests to his private banquets were often instructed to wear leather, or at least to carry a token item like a strip of hide or a collar. Anyone who arrived without the proper attire had to earn the right to stay, usually through public confession or performing a task whispered into their ear by one of the king's masked attendants. And then there's your fringe fact for the evening. Louis commissioned a custom throne upholstered with velvet and tanned human skin. Yeah, not metaphorically. allegedly from criminals who had wasted the gift of their bodies. Whether that's true or one of those historical exaggerations that gets juicier with every retelling is still up for debate, but the throne did exist, and it definitely had some kind of unusual leather that disturbed even the most jaded diplomats. Now, to the outside world, Louis appeared cultured and gentle. He spoke several languages, supported poets and artists, and even reformed elements of Hungarian law. His wife, Mary of Austria, sister of Emperor Charles V, was seen as his intellectual equal, though the two reportedly lived largely separate lives. Whether this was due to mutual respect or quiet avoidance, no one knows. Some accounts describe Mary as rigidly pious and unsuited to the palace atmosphere. Translation, she wasn't interested in his games, leather, or late-night sermons on sacred transgression. Here's where things take a turn toward the tragic and a little absurd. While Louis was exploring the depths of human sensuality like some kind of velvet-swathed philosopher king, the Ottoman Empire was sharpening its swords. Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent was coming, and he wasn't bringing masks and poetry. In 1526, at just 20 years old, Louis rode into battle at Mohacs to defend his kingdom, and was completely overwhelmed. His forces were crushed, his noblemen slaughtered, and Louis himself fled the battlefield on horseback, only to drown in a nearby marsh when his armour dragged him under. Not exactly the glorious warrior's death he probably imagined. Open debate time. Was Louis simply a libertine playing philosopher king, or was he ahead of his time, an early explorer of the connection between power, identity and sensuality? Some scholars argue he was unfit to rule, distracted by indulgence, and lacking the grit needed to face the rising threat from the east. Others suggest his interest in alternative rituals and pleasure was part of a broader Renaissance movement that explored human nature more honestly than any sword ever could. There's even a theory that Louis had planned to abdicate, give up the crown and disappear into a kind of mystical exile, perhaps in Italy or Bohemia, where he could live out his days as a patron of secret arts. His journals speak of a fire not meant for ruling but for knowing, and hint at disillusionment with both his crown and his military commanders. Whether he truly intended to flee or simply fantasized about escape, we'll never know. The mud swallowed both him and his dreams. So what's left of Louis II? A ruined kingdom, a scandalous journal, and a reputation whispered among historians as the Leather King. His pleasures were strange, yes, but they weren't mindless. His obsession wasn't just sex, it was meaning, transformation, the idea that through sensation the soul could be stripped bare. And maybe, if the Ottomans hadn't caught him first, he would have lived long enough to publish something truly wild. Instead, all we're left with is a story about a boy king who wrapped himself in leather and philosophy, while death marched toward his gates with a scimitar and absolutely no interest in nuance. Tonight, you ride east again, past the Alps, and across the sun-baked plains of Italy, toward a court that looks more like the set of a magic show than a medieval empire. Marble colonnades, fountains that spray rosewater, rooms filled with parrots trained to repeat Latin verses, and at the centre of it all stands Frederick II, the Holy Roman Emperor, King of Sicily, King of Jerusalem, self-declared world philosopher and owner of some of the most fascinating and highly questionable erotic habits in medieval history. If Louis II of Hungary was leather and heat, Frederick II was silk and science, and if you told him he could learn something about the universe by sleeping with someone, he'd take notes afterward. Frederick ruled from the early to mid-13th century, and he didn't just dabble in sensuality, he institutionalized it. His court in Palermo was a hotbed of intellectual brilliance, with scholars from Christian, Muslim and Jewish traditions debating astronomy and theology over dates and wine. But underneath that enlightened surface, Frederick curated an environment where erotic experimentation was encouraged, not just tolerated. Think Plato's Symposium mixed with a harem, but with charts. You've probably heard the nickname Stupor Mundi, the wonder of the world. But Frederick's wonder wasn't always of the holy kind. He commissioned love poems in multiple languages, ran one of the largest harems in Christendom outside of the Ottoman Empire, and had a court physician whose only job, reportedly, was to keep track of the emperor's libido. Frederick didn't just want pleasure. He wanted to understand it, classify it, categorize the types of kisses, rhythms, climaxes, sighs. His chambers, according to surviving notes, may have been the site of early case studies, complete with observations and diagrams, though don't go expecting footnotes. Frederick's science of sex was handwritten and very much not peer-reviewed. The harem itself was something of an enigma. Located in Lucre, it was originally established as a colony for Muslim captives who had served Frederick loyally. But this wasn't just a reward. Lucera became a kind of socio-political experiment. Muslim concubines, Arab scholars, African dancers, and Sicilian poets all lived within a sprawling walled compound designed by Frederick himself. There were rotating roles, recorded music experiments, and rumours of mirror-lined chambers where the emperor watched erotic dances while sipping saffron tea and debating with clerics on the metaphysical symbolism of desire. And here's your quirky tidbit. Frederick had a trained falcon that allegedly he used to select his bed partners on certain nights. Yes, a falcon. He'd release it inside the harem, and whichever woman it landed near was summoned. Whether the falcon had preferences or just flew toward whoever had a mouse in their sleeve is unclear. But the story held enough weight that it shows up in two separate 14th century chronicles. One monk even called it the bird of lust, which feels both poetic and deeply uncomfortable. Open debate alert. Was Frederick a progressive sensual philosopher king, or just a decadent emperor disguising his appetites as science? Some historians argue he genuinely saw no boundary between the physical and the spiritual, that for him sex wasn't just an urge, it was a language, like mathematics or music worth exploring to its deepest depths. Others claim it was all just another expression of his ego, that the charts, the rituals, the intellectualized sensuality, it was all about control, about feeding his belief that he alone could understand what others feared. He also didn't shy away from public controversy. When the Pope excommunicated him, not once, but twice, Frederick responded not with repentance, but with literary shade. He commissioned a poem accusing the Church of spiritual impotence, and suggested that maybe, just maybe, celibacy was making them stupid. He called cardinals red-robed virgins with sharp tongues and cold hands, which frankly is so specific it must have been based on a real experience. One of his boldest moves was commissioning an erotic text called De Arte Amatoria Corporalis, or The Art of Physical Love. Only fragments of it survive, but what remains is shockingly direct. Descriptions of pleasure, emotional technique, and even rhythm patterns. Think of it as Kama Sutra meets the Renaissance, minus the Enlightenment. Unfortunately, most of it was destroyed during one of the many papal purges that followed Frederick's death, though a few paragraphs still exist in private collections and university archives. They're steamy, yes, but also bizarrely academic. One section reads, "Touch not as though you own, but as though you read." Despite all of this, Frederick did marry. 3 times, in fact. His first wife, Constance of Aragon, died young. His second, Isabella of England, was shipped in like royal cargo, and reportedly spent most of her marriage living apart from him, sending increasingly irritated letters about the lack of intimacy and respect. His third wife, Isabella of Jerusalem, gave him a claim to the Holy City, and almost nothing else. Frederick seemed to treat his marriages like treaties, while his true romantic and erotic life played out far from the chapel. One of his most intriguing relationships was with a woman known only as the Black Rose, a Moorish poet and dancer who reportedly lived in Lucera, and wrote sensual verses that Frederick had transcribed and preserved in his personal library. Some say she was his lover for years, others believe she was an intellectual equal, maybe even a collaborator on De Arte Amatoria. Her identity remains lost, but one of her verses survives. "A touch may open kingdoms, but a whisper rules them." Frederick died in 1250, still excommunicated, still brilliant, and probably still planning his next experiment. He left behind an empire in pieces, and a reputation that flickers between genius and degenerate depending on who's telling the story. The Vatican breathed a sigh of relief. His courtiers, less so. Many quietly relocated. A few joined monastic orders. One reportedly became a falconer, never speaking of the Lucera years again. So what do we make of him? Frederick II may have been the only medieval king who believed knowledge could be found in the bedroom as easily as the battlefield, who saw the body not as a weakness, but as a teacher. And in doing so, he created a court where science, art, and sensuality were braided into a single tapestry, beautiful, strange, and deeply controversial. He didn't conquer with swords alone, sometimes it was silk, and the sharp edge of curiosity. You've been to dungeons and harems, through torture chambers dressed as temples, but now it's time for something even stranger. a castle-turned nightclub, centuries before disco balls were a thing. You're in the late 14th and early 15th centuries now, deep in Central Europe again, in the court of Sigismund of Luxembourg, King of Hungary, Croatia, Bohemia, and eventually Holy Roman Emperor. But before he piled on all those titles like designer armour, Sigismund was just a guy with too much money, a flair for drama, and an absolute obsession with costumed chaos and erotic performance. Think, if Studio 54 had been built on the ruins of a medieval monastery, and the bouncer was a guy in chainmail and eyeliner, Sigismund's reign was long, chaotic, and politically messy, but none of that stopped him from throwing the most scandalous parties in Christendom. His favourite haunt was Visegrad Castle, perched on a high cliff over the Danube. From the outside, it looked like the kind of place where grim-faced knights discussed border treaties. But inside, the walls were covered in crimson and gold brocade, mirrored halls reflected candlelight like a fever dream, and the scent of clove oil, sweat, and something suspiciously like cinnamon hung thick in the air. People didn't go to Sigismund's court to discuss taxes. They went to disappear into masks, music, and behaviour that made even the Venetians blush. He was obsessed with identity reversal. Nobles would arrive in servant costumes, servants in noble attire. Gender swapping wasn't just permitted, it was encouraged. The whole court became a playground of mixed signals, fake names, secret rooms, and sensory overload. Guests received invitation scrolls sealed with wax and cryptic phrases like, "Enter as moonlight, exit as flame," which sounds cool until you realise that one guy reportedly took it literally and had to be pulled out of a bonfire. The theme that night: purification through desire. Subtle, Sigismund, real subtle. One recurring ritual at these parties was called the Parade of Temptations, where guests lined up in 2 rows, blindfolded, while masked performers whispered confessions and fantasies into their ears. The goal: reach the end of the line without breaking character, or composure. If you did, you were escorted into the Room of Mirrors, which sounds ominous and, yeah, kind of was. Some said it was where Sigismund conducted his private interviews. Others say it was just a fancy name for his bedchamber, renovated to reflect pleasure from every possible angle. Either way, if you emerged from the room smiling, you were considered blessed. If you emerged crying, you were sent to the kitchens for a week to cool off. Now, Sigismund wasn't just in it for kicks. He had this philosophical framework underpinning his carnal carnival. He believed that truth, political, spiritual, even emotional, was only possible through extreme vulnerability. That by stripping people of identity, title, and shame, he could see who they truly were. Some might call that genius. Others might call it a mental breakdown with excellent lighting. And here's your quirky fringe fact. Sigismund invented his own scent. That's right, a custom fragrance made from ambergris, pine resin, crushed violets, and something called moonthorn, a blend used exclusively in the royal perfumery at Visegrad. He wore it constantly and insisted all his inner court do the same. Visitors described the scent as so strong it curled the tongue, but also strangely addictive. Some claim the fragrance caused hallucinations, though that probably had more to do with the wine laced with poppy tincture than the cologne. Open scholarly debate. Was Sigismund a pervert hiding behind art, or a genuine believer in transformational sensuality? His letters offer mixed clues. One to a Bohemian bishop reads like a theological manifesto on erotic revelation. Another to a Hungarian count ends with a sketch of a woman dancing topless, while holding a burning scroll. The symbolism, deliberately vague, but the pattern is clear. For Sigismund, sex and spectacle weren't distractions from ruling, they were part of it. A test, a strategy, an invitation to chaos with just enough poetry to keep you from running away. His wife, Barbara of Scilly, was just as complicated. Far from being an unwilling participant, she was often the co-director of these events. In fact, some of the more outlandish theme nights, like the Garden of Submission, which required guests to crawl through rooms decorated like biblical temptation scenes, were rumoured to be her idea. Barbara wasn't just a partner in pleasure. She was a political shark, rumoured alchemist, and, depending on which chronicler you believe, a practising witch. Together, they were like the Beyoncé and Jay-Z of erotic court politics, except with more torture instruments and way less chill. And yet all this decadence didn't make Sigismund a weak ruler. He negotiated peace treaties, led crusades, and outmanoeuvred the papacy more than once. But he never gave up his nighttime performances. He saw no contradiction between the battlefield and the bedroom and between the crown and the mask. Even at the Council of Constance, meant to end a massive religious schism, Sigismund insisted on hosting masked banquets every week, where bishops dined with actors, and theological debates occasionally gave way to interpretive dance. One cardinal reportedly fled in horror. Another came back 3 nights in a row. As he aged, the parties grew stranger, more intimate. The number of guests shrank. The performances took on a more spiritual edge. One night Sigismund had his entire court reenact the Book of Revelation, with himself as the whore of Babylon. Yes, you read that right. He rode in on a painted horse covered in crimson silk, declaring judgment and salvation through pleasure. There's no record of who won, but no one left early. He died in 1437, quietly, in bed, without masks or incense. Just a few attendants and a letter half-written to Barbara about the dance of the mirrored heart. Whatever that means. Maybe nothing, or maybe everything if you lived in his world, where politics was theatre, power was sensual, and identity was a costume to be changed as often as your robes. Sigismund's reign left no great monument, no clear legacy, except the stories. The perfumes, the tapestries that scholars still puzzle over. He wasn't trying to leave an empire. He was trying to leave a myth, and in the flicker of candlelight and the rustle of silk he succeeded. Because even now, centuries later, people still whisper about the castle where no one wore their real face. And every pleasure had a name. Tonight, you find yourself in the wind-lashed highlands of Scotland, where the mist creeps in through stone corridors and the air smells faintly of heather, firewood and something sharp, like mercury or mischief. This is the late 15th century, and you're about to meet James IV of Scotland, a king caught between chivalric tradition and explosive curiosity, who managed to blend scholarship, seduction, and straight-up medieval weirdness into one of the most chaotic royal love lives ever penned in passive-aggressive abbey records. James IV is often remembered as a Renaissance king. He spoke multiple languages, patronised poets and scientists, and tried to pull Scotland kicking and screaming into the modern age. But while he was funding bridges and commissioning sonnets, he was also sneaking around Edinburgh Castle, experimenting with aphrodisiacs, collecting mistresses like wine bottles, and, this is real, running a secret alchemical lab specifically devoted to boosting libido. Let's pause there. This wasn't some candle and herbs operation tucked into a spare kitchen. James built a full-on alchemical tower at Stirling Castle, staffed with hired astrologers, foreign apothecaries, and one terrifying monk named Brother Damien, who allegedly mixed potions so strong they made courtiers hallucinate for days. The king's favourite blend was called Red Fire of Venus, a glowing elixir with ingredients that included saffron, honey, ground pearls, and a few things too disturbing to list here. James swore it made his desire as bold as the lion and as swift as the falcon, which is both poetically impressive and biologically confusing. The potions weren't just for him, James gave them as gifts, to lovers, to allies, even to enemies. There's a letter in the archives from a Danish noble thanking James for the sacred water of flame, which has cured my hesitation in matters of passion. Another letter, far less flattering, calls the potion a demon's wine, and accuses it of causing marital disorder. So yes, medieval Viagra with a side of witchcraft and diplomacy. But James didn't stop at chemistry. He also conducted what he called behavioural trials. Translation, he liked to mix people together, watch how they reacted, and then write about it. He once held a banquet where guests were secretly served herbal mixtures meant to enhance attraction, then encouraged to participate in a post-dinner confession circle, where they whispered desires into each other's ears behind a curtain embroidered with astrological symbols. It was meant to reveal the true nature of human longing, or at least get people to kiss strangers. Mission accomplished. Here's your quirky tidbit. James believed the alignment of planets influenced not just mood or fate, but taste. He delayed dinners until Venus was in a favourable house, claiming it would make the food taste sweeter and increase the beauty of those at the table. One English ambassador noted dryly, "The king waited for the moon to bless his roast, though the meat was cold by the time it met our plates." Of course, it wasn't all potions and poetry. James had a famously complicated romantic life. He fathered at least 7 illegitimate children by multiple women, all while maintaining a public image of chivalric restraint. His most notorious mistress was Marion Boyd, a noble woman with a sharp tongue and a scandalous past. The two had a passionate affair that reportedly involved elaborate role-play, including disguises, staged abductions, and once a fake trial where James played both judge and accused. According to one palace servant's account, the trial ended with Marion sentencing James to a night of penitential submission, which we're just going to leave to your imagination. Eventually, James married Margaret Tudor, sister of Henry VIII, part of a peace deal that never really took. Margaret was pragmatic and politically sharp, but not overly fond of her husband's wandering affections, or his tendency to hold ritual baths with his astrologers. She once wrote to her brother complaining that James wastes the night chasing stars and the day chasing skirts. She wasn't wrong. The royal court, meanwhile, was constantly on edge. On one hand, they admired James for his mind. He spoke fluent Latin, debated theology with bishops, and personally funded the construction of printing presses. On the other hand, he kept disappearing for studies that usually involved secret tunnels, masked visitors, and the occasional peasant girl disguised as a wood nymph. He once wrote a poem called The Veil of Night about a lover who visited him in dreams and tasted of honey and iron. Scholars still debate whether it was allegory, hallucination, or just the result of drinking too much red fire of Venus. Here's the thing. James genuinely believed that love and sex were keys to understanding the universe. He wasn't some mindless hedonist. He thought desire could open the door to higher knowledge, that the human body, like the stars, held patterns, pulses, and revelations waiting to be unlocked. His court astrologer wrote that James once claimed, "Each climax is a glimpse of the divine," which again sounds like something you'd hear at a very intense yoga retreat. But then, as always in history, real life showed up like a tax collector and a collector. James got pulled into war with England, specifically with his brother-in-law Henry VIII, who had no patience for potions, planets, or poetry. In 1513, James led an army into England, convinced that destiny, omens, and the strength of his soul would carry him to victory. Instead, he got himself killed at the Battle of Flodden, his body torn apart on the field, so mangled it was barely identifiable. His potions didn't save him, his wisdom didn't shield him, his erotic philosophies, so carefully cultivated, were scattered with the rest of his papers. Margaret ruled as regent. The court sobered up, the alchemical tower was sealed. Open debate time: was James IV a visionary lost too early, or a king so caught up in his experiments he forgot the world could still kill him with a sword? Historians still argue it out. Some say he was centuries ahead of his time, blending science and emotion, with a sophistication rarely seen in medieval monarchs. Others say he was just a man who got distracted by lust and incense when he should have been drilling his army. Either way, one thing's for certain. James IV believed in the transformative power of passion. He wasn't playing games. He thought love, lust, and longing were alchemical in nature, capable of turning flesh into insight and pleasure into revelation. And for a little while, beneath the cold skies of Scotland, he turned his castle into a living laboratory, where every kiss might hold the meaning of the stars. Now we're heading back to the mountains and shadows of Eastern Europe, to a land where superstition seeps into the soil and blood runs just a little thicker. You've already met Vlad the Impaler, our bloodthirsty party host from Wallachia, but tonight we're spending time with one of his lesser-known descendants, and if Vlad was the blade, then this prince was the whisper, a nobleman whose court became infamous not for its executions, but for its games. Welcome to the erotic humiliation rituals of Minea Rao, Minna the Bad, who ruled Wallachia for a brief chaotic stretch in the late 15th century. His reputation? Part political tyrant, part sadistic performer, and completely lost to time, except for the rumours that never stopped circling the Carpathian winds. Let's start with the basics. Minea was the son of Vlad the Impaler, so you already know this family didn't do normal. Raised on stories of fear and control, Minea inherited not just the throne, but a warped understanding of intimacy, loyalty, and performance. Unlike his father, Minea didn't care much for grand military campaigns. His battles were fought indoors, behind thick stone walls and velvet drapes, where the weapon of choice was shame and the reward was obedience. According to the letters from Saxon merchants and exiled Wallachian nobles, Minea kept a private court chamber known only as the theatre. It wasn't a theatre in the modern sense. There were no velvet seats, no stage, just a round room beneath the castle, lit by oil lamps and painted ceiling to floor with the biblical scenes in which all the saints wore blindfolds. Very subtle, right? In the centre, a heavy wooden platform, surrounded by a ring of chains and rope pulleys. This was where Minea conducted what he called his tests of loyalty, but they were more like emotionally charged trust falls from a nightmare. Guests, lovers, and even advisors were summoned to the theatre and asked to perform confessions, not necessarily of crimes, but of desires. Minea would sit in a high-backed chair, cloaked in black and wearing gloves perfumed with lavender. Participants were often made to disrobe symbolically, of course, while masked attendants acted out scenes described by Minea himself. Sometimes the participants were required to watch, sometimes they were required to take part. The rules changed, that was the point, but it didn't end there. Minea took special interest in those who flinched. If someone looked away, hesitated, or refused to engage, they were publicly humiliated the next day, forced to wear white robes with painted symbols of their weaknesses: lust, pride, cowardice. The robes were burned at dusk. The participants were made to bathe in cold water, surrounded by jeering servants trained in a very specific script of taunts. One phrase repeated often: "Through shame comes strength." Quirky fringe fact for you, Minea had a fascination with mirrors, but not for vanity. He believed mirrors reflected the soul, distorted by the viewer's emotional state. He once commissioned a set of 13 curved mirrors, each designed to reflect specific moods: anger, sorrow, arousal, betrayal. These were installed in the theatre and used during certain games, where participants were required to describe what they saw in their own reflection. If they gave the wrong answer, meaning not the one Minea was hoping for, they were locked in the room overnight, with incense and wine, and no windows. Was this about sex? Yes. Was it only about sex? Not even close. Minea was obsessed with control through intimacy. He didn't want loyalty from fear alone. He wanted people to tie their shame, their secrets, their most vulnerable desires to him. If they laughed, credit, or begged in his presence, he believed he owned a piece of them. And once owned, they wouldn't betray him. That was the theory anyway. His most famous companion, if you can call her that, was a Romani dancer named Anka, known in legend as the Red Wolf. She performed at his coronation, then vanished into his inner court for nearly a year. When she re-emerged, she wore red robes lined with gold thread and carried a staff carved with scenes of submission and triumph. She was said to orchestrate the theatre rituals in his absence, and once led an entire delegation of noblemen through a silent 3-hour procession of symbolic self-flagellation. That night's theme? Humility before the crown. History can't confirm if she and Minea were lovers, partners in sadism, or just co-authors of psychological terror, but whatever they were, they understood spectacle. Here's your open scholarly debate. Was Minea mentally unstable like so many of the Draculesti line, or was he performing a deliberate strategy? Some argue that his humiliation rituals were a warped evolution of the Byzantine concept of sacred monarchy, blending divine power with erotic reverence to craft an unshakable image of dominance. Others say he was simply traumatized by his father's legacy, raised on fear and impalement, and tried to rewrite the script with theatre instead of swords. The result? Still terrifying, just more performative. Despite all this, Minea did try to rule. Briefly, he implemented tax reforms, he oversaw a rebuilding of monastic schools, but every time he tried to act like a normal monarch, some scandal from the theatre leaked out. A disgraced bishop, a weeping nobleman found wandering naked in the woods, a merchant who claimed to have seen the devil weep in the presence of that prince. It always came back to his private rituals. Eventually the church had enough. He was excommunicated, exiled, and later assassinated by enemies who, ironically, may have once worn masks for him in the theatre. His final words, according to legend, were whispered to a page boy: "Do not let the curtain fall too soon. Make of that what you will." Today, Minea the Bad is a footnote in Romanian history. Most of what we know comes from foreign accounts and folklore, burned letters, smuggled drawings, offhand mentions in merchant diaries. But every so often, a scholar stumbles on a fresco, a scratched note, or an oddly symbolic carving in a ruined castle that seems too elaborate to be coincidence. And when they do, they remember. Somewhere in the Carpathians, there once was a prince who ruled not by the sword but by gaze, shame, and the strange intimacy of surrender. Tonight, we're veering sharply into territory that's both scandalous and a little misunderstood. Because now you're following the trail of a woman, yes, a queen, not a king, whose erotic entanglements and political sabotage were so legendary they still echo in dark corners of history classrooms and half-whispered pub legends across Europe. This is Isabella of France, often called the she-wolf of France, and while her story is usually framed in terms of murder, betrayal and rebellion, there's one element that keeps resurfacing like an inconvenient ghost: the iron rod. Now, before you get too excited, no one knows for sure what the iron rod looked like. Was it a literal weapon? A metaphor for male potency? A euphemism that spiraled out of control over centuries of bad Latin translations and salacious monk gossip? Whatever it was, it's permanently fused to the legend of Isabella's illicit lover, Roger Mortimer, the English nobleman who, by all accounts, seduced her, not just into his bed, but into a full-scale coup against her husband, King Edward II. And that, my dear listener, is how medieval erotopolitics works, with steel silk and secrets carved into stone. Let's set the scene. It's the early 1300s. Isabella is the daughter of the French king and the queen consort of England, married to Edward II, a monarch widely considered incompetent, and more importantly, widely suspected of favouring his male companions a little too much. Most famously, Piers Gaveston and later Hugh Despenser the Younger, men who weren't just political advisors but, many believed, the king's lovers. Isabella, married off at 12, found herself sidelined in her own court, increasingly isolated, increasingly bitter, and increasingly furious that her husband ignored her, in favour of arrogant, eyeliner-wearing favourites who insulted her publicly and wielded more power than she ever could. And then enters Mortimer, dashing, exiled, dangerous, and, if the chronicles are to be believed, absolutely dripping in bad boy energy. The two met in France around 1325, while Isabella was on a diplomatic mission to her homeland. Mortimer had escaped imprisonment in England and was living in defiant exile, waiting for someone brave, or reckless, enough to challenge Edward's rule. The attraction between them, said one chronicler, was like wine igniting a flame already trembling. Subtle, real subtle. Within months, Isabella and Mortimer were not only lovers but co-conspirators, raising an army to invade England and overthrow her husband. But here's where things get bizarre. After they successfully took control, Isabella had her husband imprisoned, and allegedly subjected him to a very specific punishment. And here comes the infamous story. According to later reports, most of them suspiciously theatrical, Edward II was murdered not by sword or poison, but by the insertion of a red-hot iron rod into his nether regions. The idea was to leave no visible wounds, ensuring the king died of sorrow, at least in public eyes. Whether this is historically accurate is still hotly debated. Some think Edward was quietly smothered or starved. Others believe he escaped and lived in secrecy. But the iron rod? It stuck, in people's imaginations, in the records, and most scandalously in connection to Isabella's name. So was the iron rod a symbol of revenge for sexual humiliation? A metaphor for emasculating a king who had neglected his queen for male lovers? Or was it just the ultimate medieval tabloid headline? Part misogyny, part horror, part erotica? Scholars are divided. What we do know is that Isabella was later portrayed as a woman who didn't just rebel, she dominated. One French historian claimed she taught England to fear its queens. Another simply called her the Mother of Shadows. Here's your quirky detail. After seizing power, Isabella held court in London for a year wearing mourning black. Not for Edward, but as a political statement. She claimed it was a symbol of England's suffering under his rule. But that didn't stop her from holding lavish nighttime banquets featuring minstrels, jesters, and, more controversially, erotic poetry performed by candlelight. There's one fragment of a poem, attributed to a court bard in her service, that reads, "She speaks not in cries, but in cut silk and heavy footsteps. Where men once led, she drags them by the root." That last line? Let's just say scholars still argue about what exactly was being dragged. Mortimer, meanwhile, went from lover to political strongman overnight. He took titles, seized lands, and even signed treaties as if he were king. But his rise was too fast, too bold. By 1330, the young Edward III, Isabella's son, had had enough. In a swift palace coup, Mortimer was arrested and hanged. No trial, no mercy. Just a rough end for a man who may have held England's most dangerous queen in his arms. As for Isabella, she was imprisoned, though not harshly. She lived out her remaining years at Castle Rising, where she maintained a small court, took long walks by candlelight, and, if the records are to be believed, kept a silver box filled with letters, jewels, and a small iron rod. The box was said to be buried with her. or maybe hidden. Either way, it's never been found. Now here's the open scholarly debate. Was Isabella a proto-feminist icon, rising up against a neglectful, possibly abusive husband in a world that saw queens as pawns? Or was she a ruthless manipulator who used sex and scandal to claw her way to temporary power? It depends on who you hung. Modern historians lean toward complexity. A woman trapped in a marriage that denied her agency, who used the tools available, charm, intellect, seduction, to fight back. But those older chroniclers, they painted her as a femme fatale, dripping in vengeance, controlling men through whispers and silk gloves laced with venom. Whatever the truth, one thing's certain: Isabella blurred the line between politics and eroticism in a way no other queen quite managed. She didn't just resist her husband, she replaced him, and in doing so she carved out a place in history not as the grieving widow, but as the iron-willed architect of one of England's darkest royal scandals. So the next time someone tells you medieval women were passive, obedient, or powerless, just say one name: Isabella, and maybe give a knowing look. Because in her world, power wasn't always won with a sword. Sometimes it came wrapped in velvet, cloaked in smoke, and held tight in a silver box. So now we're sliding southwest into the tangled, moody kingdom of Navarre, a little patch of Europe squeezed between Spain and France, with more family feuds than a medieval soap opera, and enough royal backstabbing to make Game of Thrones look like a group therapy session. And at the centre of it all, Charles II of Navarre, nicknamed Charles the Bad. Not subtle, not flattering, and as it turns out, not entirely inaccurate. Charles was one of those medieval monarchs who seemed physically incapable of making a decision that wasn't soaked in manipulation, petty revenge, or suspiciously erotic undertones. A king of kinks, if ever there was one, hidden beneath the armour and politics like a snake coiled in ermine robes. Born in 1322, Charles was raised in a world where everyone was scheming for more land, more power, or just a slightly less awful death. His mother was Joan II, Queen of Navarre in her own right, and his father was a member of the Capetian dynasty. So Charles was no backwater upstart. He was nobility stacked on nobility, with entitlement practically leaking from his pores. And with that bloodline came a ferocious sense of mine to rule, mine to take, mine to enjoy, especially when it came to pleasure. Charles is best known for his erratic behaviour, which was described even by contemporary chroniclers as hot, cold, and mostly burning. But what rarely gets discussed is the private behaviour that earned him his more salacious nickname. The whispers started early. Palace servants claimed he had rooms outfitted with soft chains and polished stones, so smooth and curved they resembled polished thighs. One chambermaid reportedly fled court after being summoned to clean the velvet vault, a hidden room with curved mirrors, padded walls, and a single stone pedestal in the centre with a carved handprint on top. What it was used for? We can only guess, but none of the guesses are G-rated. Charles's court was full of masks and balls, midnight feasts, and allegorical games, which were really just polite medieval code for roleplay with political figures disguised as gods, monsters, and, on more than one occasion, pieces of furniture. In one infamous scene described by a Burgundian ambassador, and you know it's wild when an ambassador takes notes, Charles orchestrated a play called The Binding of Loyalty. Guests wore blindfolds, were led through torch-lit hallways, and made to kneel before the goddess of punishment, a role played, awkwardly, by his own cousin. There was symbolic flogging, poetry that bordered on erotic prophecy, and a concluding banquet where guests ate from each other's laps. Charles insisted these rituals had spiritual significance. That humiliation purged sin, that submission revealed truth, that watching his enemies beg on all fours, half-dressed and covered in powdered gold, brought him closer to divine justice. Or maybe he just liked it. Either way, it became a hallmark of his reign. Control through sensual confusion. Pleasure twisted into obedience. Shame weaponized into loyalty. Now here's your fringe fact. Charles was obsessed with the idea of heat. He believed fire could cure any illness, stimulate virility, and in his words, burn falsehood from flesh. So he had his personal chambers heated to extreme temperatures, even in summer. The walls were lined with braziers, and servants were required to oil his skin daily to protect it from the constant heat. He claimed the sweat purified the body and awakened the soul. He also, according to one physician's account, believed that heated stone improved performance during nightly devotions, a term so vague and so obviously dirty that it deserves a slow clap. Charles's mistresses weren't just lovers, they were tools. Each one, it seemed, served a role. There was Isolde, a noblewoman known for her fierce temper, who often accompanied Charles to council meetings dressed as a falconer. Then there was the unnamed Rose Knight, a boy from the southern valleys, described in a single court poem as His Majesty's songbird, who sings through teeth and bites through prayers. That line was censored in later versions, but the implication remains. Charles didn't just love, he curated his intimacy like a gallery, one that mixed pain, power and performance in ways the church found unsettling to say the least. And speaking of the church, Charles constantly danced on the edge of excommunication. He flirted with heresy both literally and figuratively. He once hosted a dinner for a group of monks, only to stage a dramatic pantomime during the third course, where angels descended to seduce sinners with perfumed chains. The monks were horrified. Charles laughed. One chronicler said he clapped like a child watching a puppet show. Another claimed he sent each monk home with a carved token in the shape of a serpent wrapped around a cross. Open debate time. Was Charles the Bad truly bad? Or just so radically theatrical, so unashamedly sensual and performative in his politics, that history couldn't find another label? His enemies certainly called him wicked, but his supporters saw him as brilliant, a man who used scandal and spectacle to destabilise rivals and consolidate power. His odd rituals often coincided with diplomatic shifts. After one particularly debauched court gathering, he secured an alliance with Castile that no one thought possible. Coincidence? Or manipulation through erotic theatre? Still, his luck didn't last. In 1387, at age 54, Charles fell ill. The diagnosis? A wasting fever. The treatment? His own prescription, full-body wrapping in brandy-soaked cloth, followed by light ignition to stimulate the blood. Yes, you read that right. They set him on fire. Not a lot of fire. Just a small ceremonial blaze to, jump-start his immune system. Except, no one thought to snuff it out in time. He burned alive in his own bed, surrounded by screaming servants and a physician who reportedly fainted at the sight. Poetic? Certainly. Ironic? Absolutely. Charles the Bad, King of Heat, consumed by the very flames he thought would make him immortal. After his death, most of his private documents were destroyed, likely out of panic, shame or self-preservation. But a few fragments survived, letters with veiled invitations, sketches of ritual masks, notes in the margins of legal scrolls that say things like, "Apply oil before binding," and "Do not let the song begin before the third bell." A puzzle with half its pieces missing, but the shape is still clear. A ruler who ruled not by the sword but by seduction, staging, and a very unsettling understanding of what people would do to stay close to power. Charles the Bad didn't just wear the crown, he performed it. And every act, every ritual, every whispered command beneath torchlight was part of a play that never ended. Until, of course, the curtain fell, in flames. Now we're drifting into the dreamlike hills of Bavaria, where castles sprout like enchanted mushrooms and swans glide eerily across black lakes, as if waiting for some forgotten spell to lift. Welcome to the glittering lonely world of Ludwig II of Bavaria, the mad king, the fairy tale builder, and, let's be real, the patron saint of repressed obsessions, swan-themed bedrooms, and very questionable hiring practices when it came to royal servants. Because behind those iconic turrets and murals of Wagnerian heroes was a man caught between fantasy and desire, whose life became one long, exquisite hallucination of erotic symbolism and silent longing. Born in 1845, Ludwig grew up surrounded by cold protocol and colder parents. From a young age he was drawn not to politics or war, but to art, mythology, and the kind of stories where men wore armour, sang in forests and died tragically beautiful deaths. By the time he was crowned king at 18, Ludwig was already retreating into a world of romantic fantasy, and that retreat only got deeper, stranger and more sensual as the years rolled on. Let's start with the swans. Ludwig was obsessed with them. He decorated entire rooms with swan motifs, murals, chandeliers, doorknobs shaped like necks in mid-arch. They symbolised purity, yes, but also scant, aching devotion. He wrote in one letter that the swan was the lover who speaks only through gesture and dies if it sings. Which, okay, sounds poetic, until you realise he assigned his lovers swan nicknames and sometimes made them wear feathered masks to bed. And then there were the Swan Boys, young men employed in his private residences, chosen for their delicate beauty, musical soul skill, and an unspoken willingness to participate in Ludwig's strange routines. Officially they were valets or companions. Unofficially they were the flesh and blood pieces of his fantasy kingdom. He gave them gifts, wrote them poems, and directed them in their elaborate tableaux vivants, live-action scenes from mythology and opera, often stitches in his bedchambers, with costumes, candlelight, and strict instructions for how each godbout should pose and move. Did he sleep with them? That's the million-guilder question. Ludwig's sexuality has been the subject of intense speculation for over a century. Private diaries and letters strongly suggest he was romantically, and probably physically, interested in men, though he remained tormented by guilt. He was deeply Catholic, emotionally fragile, and painfully aware of the pressures around him. His letters are a tug-of-war between desire and denial. He once wrote to a confidant, "I love him with a fire that shames the sun, and yet I must pretend I merely admire his voice." Here's your quirky detail. Ludwig once designed a private theatre beneath Neuschwanstein Castle, with a stage built entirely from mirrors and a mechanism that slowly rotated the viewer's platform. He called it the Temple of Reflection. Only he and a few initiated companions were allowed inside. It was rumoured that guests, always male, would be asked to dress as swan knights or Greek heroes and reenact scenes from Wagner's operas, sometimes in silence, sometimes in whispered poetry. The walls were lined with velvet. No music was ever written down. It was all memory, all myth, all Ludwig. His romantic life was a cascade of near misses and self-sabotage. He was briefly engaged to his cousin, Duchess Sophie, but broke it off, citing his love of solitude, code for, "I'm really not into women." He later claimed he'd been visited by the ghost of Richard Wagner, who told him the marriage would doom his artistic soul. Sure, that's definitely why he cancelled. Ludwig's love for Wagner was its own opera. He idolised the composer to a frankly uncomfortable degree, writing him endless letters, funding his productions, and once attempting to build an underground concert hall so that the music would rise from the earth like the voice of God. Wagner, for his part, enjoyed the money, but got increasingly weirded out by the attention. The relationship soured, but the damage was done. Ludwig's romantic ideal was forever tied to the aesthetic of doomed male beauty, noble suffering and symphonic longing. Here's where things get truly bizarre. Ludwig began commissioning castles, not one or two, but several each, more ornate and theatrical than the last. Neuschwanstein, Linderhof, Herrenchiemsee. They weren't homes, they were sets. Each one was themed, French Rococo, Grail mythology, Sun King fantasy. Every room told a story, every hallway was a narrative. And the bedrooms? Oh, the bedrooms were designed like opera boxes. He once had a bed crafted with a carved canopy of angels, holding torches and, allegedly, a secret compartment in the mattress for hidden letters, or hidden hands. The most famous of these rooms had a ceiling painted to resemble the night sky, complete with constellations that glowed when candles were lit behind the canvas. It was said that Ludwig liked to lie there in seance with one of his companions and whisper the stories of the stars to them. But the stories were always altered. In his versions, Orion falls in love with Hercules. The swan loves the man, not the woman. Venus weeps alone, but even the most carefully constructed dream can't keep reality out forever. Ludwig's spending grew insane. His ministers were panicking. He stopped attending council meetings, stopped signing laws, and spent days hiding in castles, writing letters in rose-scented ink to men who often vanished quietly from court shortly after receiving them. The government finally declared him insane in 1886. The diagnosis? Paranoia and erotic fantasy compounded by delusion. His doctor had never actually examined him. 2 days later, Ludwig was found dead in Lake Starnberg, floating beside the body of his psychiatrist. The official report said drowning. The unofficial theories? Everything from assassination to suicide to some final act of romantic tragedy. He dragged the doctor in with him, or they'd struggled. No one knows. No autopsy was performed. Just a story, a rumour, and a prince forever tangled in his own reflection. The open debate remains. Was Ludwig II truly mad? Or was he a man born into the wrong century? too delicate, too poetic, too unwilling to brutalise his way through power the way his peers did. Some say he was broken by repression, by that unlivable contradiction between his desires and his image. Others believe he created exactly what he wanted, a private universe where fantasy reigned, and no one could touch him without playing the part he'd written for them. In the end, Ludwig's world wasn't meant to last. His castles became museums, his swan boys grew up, vanished, or faded into legend. But his dream, lush, tormented, romantic, still echoes in every echo chamber and mirrored hall he left behind. A kingdom of longing, built not from stone, but from starlight and silence. Now sail west, out of the soft gloom of Bavaria, and into the salt-bitten winds of the North Sea, where the water stings like betrayal and the fog hides more than just pirate ships. Because tonight's tale doesn't unfold in a throne room or velvet-draped chamber. It rolls across the cold decks of stolen vessels under blood-red flags. Meet Eric of Pomerania, the man who started as a crowned king and ended up as a pirate warlord with a taste for scandal, passion, and the occasional surprise attack on a monastery. Eric ruled not just one kingdom, but three, Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, all through the tangled Kalmar Union in the early 15th century. On paper, he was a unifying figure, groomed by his formidable adoptive mother, Queen Margaret I, to hold together the Nordic crown. But Eric had, let's call them, distractions. First there was his obsession with pageantry, then his violent temper, and most enduringly his suspicious habit of surrounding himself with dangerously attractive bodyguards, many of whom doubled as performers, falconers, or, in at least one documented case, professional dancers who couldn't hold a sword but knew how to pour mead very, very suggestively. Eric's royal courts were infamous for lavish feasts that often escalated into dramatic midnight rituals. According to chroniclers, who were clearly not getting paid enough to make this up, guests were often blindfolded before entering the hall, led through incense clouds and seated according to scent preference. That's right, Eric had a pleasure ranking system based on how someone's skin reacted to musk. You got better wine if you passed the sniff test, but that was just the beginning. Eric cultivated what one Swedish bishop called a shadow court of silken warriors, a hand-picked entourage of young men, some noble, some mysteriously backgroundless, who accompanied him everywhere. They were described in letters as not soldiers, nor lovers, but something between, with sharp tongues and smoother hands. These men were fiercely loyal, absurdly well-dressed, and the frequent stars of court gossip. One, a boy named Leif, appears in several court records, and just as suddenly disappears. But not before inspiring a short poem in Eric's own hand. He held the wind in his breath and my oath in his eyes. That's either a love note or a very intense weather report. Eric's erotic preferences weren't limited to the palace. When political pressures mounted, especially from nobles who didn't appreciate the perfume-drenched swordplay, Eric retreated into the seas. After being deposed in Sweden and later Norway, he didn't slink off into dignified retirement. No, Eric built a pirate fleet. From his base on the island of Gotland, he waged a maritime campaign of vengeance, targeting merchant ships and former enemies with terrifying precision and weirdly coordinated outfits. One chronicler remarked, his crew attacked with ribbons in their hair and steel in their hands. If ever there were a pirate fashion icon, it was Eric. And yes, even on the sea, the king-turned-pirate kept his sensual theatrics. His ship was known as the Silver Heron, and it was rumoured to be as much a floating boudoir as a battle vessel. Silk drapes hung over the captain's quarters, mirrors lined the inner cabin, and meals were often served by candlelight, even during storms. His crew was chosen not just for skill, but for voice. Eric was said to favour those who could sing in 3 languages or recite love poetry during windless nights. One Danish source, absolutely dripping with bitterness, called it a travelling opera of sin, directed by a traitor in swan boots. Now here's your quirky fact. Eric reportedly invented a pirate uniform that included tight crimson trousers, an embroidered tunic of blue velvet, and, for formal occasions, a cloak stitched with silver sea creatures. One of these outfits, discovered centuries later in a Swedish shipwreck, showed signs of perfume absorption in the collar, strong hints of clove, pine, and something floral no botanist can quite identify. Some believe this was his signature scent, worn during raids as both intimidation and declaration. After all, when you smell like a garden and still take hostages, people remember you. There's also the curious case of the St. Olaf Abbey incident. Eric's crew raided a monastery on the coast of Estonia, not for gold or relics, but for choristers. The monks reported that he took their best singers and left behind a bag of coins and a note that simply said, "Thank you for the voices, they'll be well used." Whether he turned the singers into his ship's personal entertainment troupe, or just wanted a better rendition of Ave Maria, while setting fire to merchant fleets, no one knows. Open scholarly debate time. Was Eric a tragic figure undone by politics and personal longing, or a narcissistic megalomaniac who treated royal duty like a role he could step in and out of when it bored him? Some argue he was a product of his time, raised to rule, then abandoned by a system that didn't understand his complexity. Others think he simply wanted power without responsibility, love without limits, and attention without end, and maybe both are true. Eric's pirate reign lasted longer than anyone expected. He operated off the Baltic coast for over a decade, outmaneuvering his enemies and living his best outlaw life in a sea-splashed dreamscape of silk and steel. Eventually, he returned to Denmark and lived out his twilight years in relative obscurity, though some say he continued to throw masked dinners in his countryside estate, complete with candle-lit sea shanties and former pirates dressed as angels. When he died in 1459, he left behind no legitimate heirs, no great monuments, and no clean reputation. But the legend of the pirate king in velvet boots, who stole hearts and ships with equal flair, has never quite vanished. Some say his ghost still haunts Gotland's shores, humming lullabies into the mist. Others just remember the stories of a king who traded his crown for a compass, and his kingdom for the thrill of dangerous intimacy. Because in the end, Eric of Pomerania didn't need a throne, he needed an audience. And every conquest, whether naval or carnal, was just another act in his endless sea-washed play. Tonight, you slip not just through time but into one of the strangest chapters in the tangled history of Europe's power players, a chapter where popes wore armour, fathers sired children with their mistresses in the Vatican, and holy men threw orgies that made brothels look tame. Yes, tonight we're talking about Rodrigo Borgia, better known as Pope Alexander VI, the man who managed to combine religious authority with one of the most shamelessly perverse personal lives ever to stain the silk of a papal robe. He wasn't a king in the traditional sense, but make no mistake, this pope ruled like one, and in many ways his Vatican looked less like a spiritual institution and more like a royal court built entirely on ambition, pleasure and scandal. Let's start with the basics. Rodrigo Borgia was Spanish by birth, shrewd by nature, and ambitious to the bone. He became pope in 1492. Yes, the same year Columbus sailed off to accidentally discover America. And his papacy quickly became synonymous with corruption, nepotism, and endless whispers about what exactly went on after dark in the Apostolic Palace. But while Rodrigo's political games were ruthless, what really raised eyebrows was the state of his bedroom, or more accurately, the rooms connected to it. He had mistresses, plural, not discreetly, not regretfully, but publicly, lavishly, and unapologetically. His most famous was Vanozza de Catane, with whom he fathered 4 children. Yes, while he was a cardinal, and yes, everyone knew, the most notorious of these children, Cesare Borgia, the handsome, calculating, and reportedly quite violent son, who bounced between priesthood and military leadership with all the grace of a Renaissance Batman villain. Then there was Lucrezia Borgia, whose name alone still drips with rumours, some fair, most fabricated, of incest, poison, and velvet-draped manipulation. But Rodrigo's personal indulgences went far beyond some open secret family tree. His Vatican was a sensual fortress. The most infamous event? That would be the Banquet of the Chestnuts held in 1501. It was a masquerade/feast/utterly deranged orgy, hosted in the papal apartments, where 50 courtesans were invited to perform entertainment for the cardinals and special guests. Chestnuts were scattered across the floor, and the women, naked or in masks, were instructed to crawl around collecting them in full view of the crowd. It's one of those events where you want to laugh till you realise that Pope planned it, and then you just sort of sit there, blinking into the abyss. There were prizes too. According to a Roman diarist who somehow survived the event with enough mental clarity to write it down, gold and fine cloth were awarded to the men who could perform the most times in one night. Perform what, you ask? Oh, you know, perform, under supervision, with witnesses, and snacks, because apparently one could not risk divine judgment on an empty stomach. Now, for your quirky fringe fact. Pope Alexander VI kept a team of astrologers on hand, not just for guidance but for erotic planning. That's right. Certain nights were deemed more cosmically aligned for pleasure, and the Pope had an actual schedule of intimacy based on the position of Venus and Mars. It was said that on highly favourable nights, the fountains in the papal gardens were filled with wine and perfumed water, and guests were encouraged to bathe together under lanterns hung from orange trees. That's either an elite Roman spa or the world's most blasphemous Airbnb. Rodrigo's sensual empire extended even into the art he commissioned. Rooms at the Vatican were redecorated under his reign, and though most of the more scandalous frescoes were painted over by later, more nervous popes fragments remain. Erotic poses disguised as mythological allegory, suggestive figures meant to glorify fertility and power. One room reportedly featured a mural of Lucrezia herself, depicted as the goddess Minerva, surrounded by semi-nude attendants. Subtle? Absolutely not. Effective? Well, the Borgia name still echoes, doesn't it? And what about the incest rumours? Were Rodrigo and his daughter too close? Did Cesare and Lucrezia have something going on? The historical jury's still out. Most modern scholars agree that the incest charges were probably propaganda, weaponised by the Borgia's enemies to discredit them. But that doesn't mean Rodrigo didn't cultivate the image of closeness. He once hosted a feast in honour of Lucrezia's eternal youth and beauty, attended entirely by men, with her seated on a throne of white lilies. One cardinal left the banquet early, claiming he had no appetite for flowers that move. Despite all this, Rodrigo wasn't stupid. He was in fact quite clever, manipulative, calculating, and politically brilliant. He used marriage alliances like chess moves, turning Lucrezia into a pawn queen who married 3 powerful men in succession, each one chosen to advance the Borgia family's reach. Her husbands had a tendency to die conveniently, mysteriously, and always just in time for the next strategic match. Rodrigo didn't see relationships as sacred. He saw them as leverage. Bodies were currency, and pleasure? Pleasure was a distraction he turned into a weapon. Open debate time. Was Rodrigo Borgia a corrupt lecher who turned the Vatican into a pleasure palace? Or a realist playing the only game that mattered in Renaissance Italy? Power at any cost? Some scholars view him as a symptom of a broken church, a man whose very existence helped trigger the Protestant Reformation. Others argue he simply pulled back the curtain on how things actually worked, refusing to pretend that virtue had anything to do with authority. He died in 1503, likely poisoned, though the records are muddled. Some say he drank from the wrong chalice, part of an assassination attempt meant for someone else. Others claim disease. His body, bloated and discoloured, was displayed in Rome, where people reportedly recoiled. One witness wrote that it seemed to rot faster than it should have, as if hell had already begun its work. And yet Rodrigo's legacy lingers, not in the dusty scrolls of papal decrees, but in the enduring image of a man who crowned himself both pontiff and pleasure-seeker. He didn't just flirt with sin. He courted it, dined with it, threw it a banquet, and in doing so turned the holiest institution in Europe into the stage for one of history's most unforgettable and most unapologetically perverted spectacles. Now we're stepping out of Europe entirely and following the warm winds of the monsoon into a very different kind of court. A royal world where sensuality wasn't just tolerated, it was celebrated. Where art, architecture, and even religion were soaked in desire. You've landed in medieval India, specifically the 9th to 11th centuries, during the rule of the Chandler dynasty, whose kings gave us one of history's most infamous and breathtaking legacies of erotic expression, the Khajuraho temples, and let's just say, if a wall could blush, these temples would need privacy screens. The Chandler kings ruled in what is now Madhya Pradesh, a rugged, forested region where the rivers run slow and the stones seem carved for storytelling. They were minor players on the broader Indian political stage, neither the largest nor the wealthiest of dynasties, but what they lacked in imperial scale, they made up for in unapologetic artistic sensuality. The centrepiece of their reign was Khajuraho, a city of temples whose exterior walls are famously, scandalously covered in erotic sculptures, hundreds of them, many of which depict acts that would make a Roman blush and a Victorian faint. But here's the twist. These temples weren't brothels or dens of sin. They were sacred spaces. These depictions of intertwined lovers, acrobatic positions and multi-limbed pleasure were expressions of Tantra, a complex spiritual philosophy that viewed sex as a path to the divine. To Chandela kings, pleasure wasn't a weakness to hide or a sin to punish. It was a tool for enlightenment, an experience through which the soul could transcend its earthly limitations. And yes, it was also a very convenient way to express dominance, fertility, and power. Legend has it that one of the early Chandela rulers, King Danga, who reigned in the 10th century, commissioned the temples after a divine vision. In the story, the moon god appeared to him and revealed that enlightenment was not achieved through renunciation, but through mastery of desire. Danga, already known for his obsession with art, poetry, and a rather robust harem, took the vision as permission, and promptly began turning his capital into an open-air textbook of sacred sensuality. The temples he built were layered with symbolism, astrology, and erotica, so explicit you'd think the masons were auditioning for something unpublishable. But they weren't pornographers. These artists were working with intense religious devotion. Every gesture, every carved limb, every arch of the back was coded. A woman with her head thrown back might represent surrender to the cosmos. A pair mid-embrace might symbolize the union of masculine and feminine energies, Shiva and Shakti, the dual divine principles. And then, of course, some of them probably were just, really into it. The Chandela court itself mirrored this philosophy. Their kings often took multiple wives and maintained royal harems, but unlike the veiled secrecy of Ottoman palaces, Chandela queens were public figures. Many participated in court rituals, temple ceremonies, and tantric rites that, if not overtly sexual, were certainly sensual. Sacred dance, ritual bathing, oil massages performed before the gods. This was a royal lifestyle built not on repression but on ritualized indulgence. Here's your fringe fact. One temple frieze depicts a man being pleasured by a woman while balancing on one hand. Whether this was a literal practice or an artistic metaphor is hotly debated. Scholars point out that the erotic panels are usually located on the outer walls, suggesting they are part of a spiritual journey. One must pass through the pleasures of the flesh before entering the sacred inner sanctum, which frankly is just good storytelling. But not everyone saw it that way. Islamic invasions in later centuries, particularly under the Delhi Sultanate and the Mughals, brought a much more conservative lens to the site. Many of the temples were defaced, sculptures were beheaded, the city fell into obscurity, swallowed by forest and shame. For hundreds of years, Khajuraho was treated like a dirty secret, a cautionary tale about what happens when kings get too comfortable with Kama Sutra aesthetics. It wasn't until the 19th century, when British officers stumbled upon the overgrown ruins, that the world was reintroduced to Khajuraho. The Brits were horrified, of course. One surveyor called the temples an abomination of marble, crafted by lunatics with greasy minds, but he still spent several months carefully cataloguing every sculpture. So, make of that what you will. Open scholarly debate time. Were the Chandela kings true tantric practitioners, or just horny monarchs hiding behind mysticism? Some argue that the tantric elements were a veneer, convenient theology to justify a court culture that prioritized sensual pleasure and physical beauty. Others insist the texts, rituals, and temple alignments prove a deep spiritual commitment to using the body as a vessel of transcendence. One thing's clear, this wasn't casual hedonism. It was a curated worldview, built into architecture, repeated in royal ritual, and carved quite literally into history. Another fun detail? Temple inscriptions mention specific festivals where couples, royal and noble, would engage in public rituals of fertility and union. These weren't crude orgies, but choreographed ceremonies with incense, music, and sacred chants. The idea wasn't just to display pleasure, but to channel it, to use arousal as a spiritual frequency that echoed through the cosmos. Or, if you're feeling cynical, a great excuse for the king to show off his flexibility. We'll never know exactly how far the Chandela kings pushed the envelope. Many of the ritual manuals are lost, buried under centuries of conquest and moral panic, but their legacy lives on, in stone in legend, and in the fact that nearly 1,000 years later, people still argue whether the Khajuraho temples are temples at all, or just the world's most beautiful adult colouring book. One thing's for sure, the Chandela dynasty ruled not with cold iron or cloaked shame, but with a worldview that dared to look desire in the eye and call it divine. For them, the body wasn't an obstacle to holiness, it was the gateway. Tonight you cross another continent, drifting east through mountains and river valleys into the orderly, brilliant heart of imperial China. But don't let the symmetry of palaces and the etiquette of scrolls fool you. Beneath the silk robes and Confucian restraint, the court of Emperor Taizu of Song held a darker, stranger undercurrent of erotic control and calculated morality. He wasn't just founding a dynasty, he was founding a system, one that reached into bedrooms, cloaked seduction in discipline, and turned intimacy into a series of tests you either passed or vanished from memory entirely. Taizu, originally named Zhao Kuangyin, rose to power in 960 CE by staging what is now known as the Chen Chao Mutiny. In a very polite coup, his soldiers persuaded him to accept the imperial throne. He agreed, reluctantly, so he claimed, and quickly consolidated the Song dynasty, ushering in an age of culture, invention, and quiet authoritarianism. Most people remember Taizu as a capable strategic ruler. What's less discussed, however, is the network of whisper-soft seductions and bizarre intimacy rituals he wove into his inner palace life. Rituals that went far beyond concubines and courtesans. Let's start with the moral games. Taizu created them to identify, reward, or remove members of his harem based not on beauty or grace, but on what he called discretion under temptation. He believed that a woman's ability to resist or navigate a set of staged erotic trials revealed her spiritual purity, and therefore her worthiness to live in the imperial court. Think of it as a hybrid between a Confucian exam and a very uncomfortable dating show. Every month a small group of concubines were selected to undergo these trials. They were brought to a garden pavilion at dusk, dressed in light gauze robes scented with jasmine, and left alone with a variety of staged temptations: wine, a poetic male attendant, never imperial rank but always beautiful, and symbolic objects, usually a scroll, a hairpin, and a red silk cord. The concubines weren't given instructions. They had to interpret the setup, choose how to behave, and then submit a written account of their reasoning the next morning. It wasn't just about resisting desire, it was about interpreting the emperor's mind. Fail the test, say indulge too openly in the wine, or flirt with the attendant, and you were dismissed from the palace, or worse, reassigned to the Bureau of Agriculture, which was not a euphemism, it was just endless paperwork about rice. One of the few surviving reports from these trials describes a concubine who passed by reciting a Confucian passage, covering the red cord with her robe, and refusing eye contact with the attendant. Taizu reportedly laughed with delight and gave her a jade pendant shaped like a lotus in bloom, a clear symbol, by the way, of purity and repressed eroticism. The Song knew how to do subtle. Here's your quirky fringe fact. Taizu had a personal bedchamber decorated in 4 seasonal themes, one for each corner of the room, with tapestries depicting spring blossoms, summer waterfalls, autumn leaves, and winter snow. Each season had its own scent, its own music, and its own roster of preferred concubines. But only one season was ever active at a time. The others were literally roped off. Changing seasons meant a full palace ritual, including the burning of last season's regrets, on scrolls tossed into bronze incense burners shaped like cranes. That same chamber had a rotating bed platform, yes, rotating, crafted by Song engineers and powered by a water wheel system. The emperor could slowly turn the bed toward a chosen season, signalling which mood or set of courtiers he favoured that week. It wasn't just lavish, it was coded. Everything in Taizu's intimate world had layers of symbolism: angles, colours, oils, even the placement of fruit trays. One misplaced peach was enough to mock a concubine as uncultured and allegedly unsuitable for court life. Now you might be asking, was any of this sexy? And the answer is, maybe? But only if you like your desire braided tightly with paranoia. Because in Taizu's palace, every interaction, every glance, every touch, was surveilled not just by eunuchs, but by meaning itself. Intimacy wasn't a moment of freedom, it was a puzzle, a performance, and sometimes a trap. He wasn't chasing pleasure, he was chasing control disguised as virtue. There's a particularly eerie story told by later Song chroniclers about a concubine named Shen Li, who during one moral trial, instead of refusing or playing coy, wrote her own poem, in blood, using a thorn from a plum branch, and left it for the emperor with no explanation. The poem was about frost settling on desire. Taizu was reportedly so moved he broke protocol, visited her in secret, and kept her in the winter corner of his bedchamber for 3 months. After that, she was never mentioned again. Some say she became a nun, others say she died mysteriously. The official records simply mark her as withdrawn to quiet reflection. Open scholarly debate. Was Taizu's strange blend of moral exams and erotic rituals a psychological power play, or a sincere philosophical experiment? Confucian scholars tend to frame it as a clever way to weed out disloyalty, but modern historians note the emperor's letters and poems hint at a more complex desire. For intimacy that was both unbreakable and entirely under his control, he didn't want just love. He wanted interpretation. A partner who could decode his signals like scripture. This craving for decipherable devotion extended beyond the palace. Taizu was known to personally review the love poetry submitted by young scholars in the civil service exams. Yes, the same exams that determined one's social status and bureaucratic future. If he found the verses too emotional or too blunt, he'd write comments in the margins. Too obvious, lacks subtlety. Form pleases, meaning does not. Imagine failing your government entrance exam because the emperor didn't vibe with your love metaphor. And that's the enduring paradox of Emperor Taizu, a man who founded one of China's most brilliant dynasties, enforced bureaucratic reform and elevated civil scholarship, while simultaneously running a sensual labyrinth of coded desire behind palace walls. His reign wasn't marked by bacchanalian excess or hedonistic spectacle. It was quieter, sharper, a whisper of silk, a flicker of candlelight, a pleasure that held a blade under its tongue. Because for Taizu, power didn't mean abandoning desire. It meant refining it, packaging it, using it not to lose control, but to deepen it. And in doing so, he turned seduction into a system, one that outlasted him, and in its quiet, burning way, still whispers from the carved walls of forgotten chambers. You're still in Asia, but now we slide further east, like a silk sleeve drawn across lacquered wood, into the elegantly restrained, achingly poetic world of Heian Era Japan. It's the 10th century, and while Europe is busy with plague and blood feuds, the Japanese imperial court is immersed in incense ceremonies, layered robes, and whispered love poems folded delicately into fans. But don't be fooled by the polished surface. Beneath the grace, the Heian court was a maze of erotic intrigue, psychological games, and scandalous pillow secrets, most of it documented by the very people living it. This is the world of the Pillow Book, written by Sei Shonagon, a court lady in service to Empress Teishi. It's one of the most intimate, sharp, and often delightfully petty records we have of daily life in the imperial palace. Sei didn't just write down the weather and who wore what. She recorded desires, small aching details of flirtation, disappointment, and the subtle erotic electricity that danced between lacquered screens and moonlit gardens. Let's start with the basics. Courtship in Heian Japan was an art form, not a process. Men and women often never saw each other's faces during early interactions. Instead, attraction bloomed through scent, poetry, and calligraphy. A man might leave a verse on a woman's pillow after sneaking into her chamber under cover of night. If she liked the poem, or his handwriting, she might reply. If not, he'd be ghosted via silence and metaphor. I find no warmth in the autumn wind was basically the 10th century version of K by. But that's just the public etiquette. The private world was a different story entirely. While rigid rules shaped external behaviour, behind closed screens things got extremely intimate, and weirdly well documented. The elite lived inside massive palaces divided by painted panels and draped fabric, with courtiers and ladies navigating the halls at night like shadowy ghosts. It was common practice for lovers to meet in secret, have their night together, and then vanish before sunrise, all without disturbing the outward calm of court life. One of the more delicious details from Sei's book, she ranked lovers, not by looks or performance, but by exit behaviour. A man who left too early was seen as cold. One who lingered awkwardly risked being called a damp presence. But a man who left at just the right time, with a final whispered poem and the scent of plum blossom lingering in his wake, that was peak seduction. For Sei and her contemporaries, sex wasn't about domination or conquest. It was about aesthetic resonance. If the robe fell beautifully, if the lantern flickered at just the right moment, if the syllables of your farewell verse matched the sigh in your partner's throat, you were a master. And here's your quirky fringe fact. Heian aristocrats wore multiple layers of robes, sometimes up to 12 in carefully orchestrated colour palettes. These weren't just fashion choices, they were coded messages. A woman's inner robe might be pale pink for affection, or green to signify jealousy. A man's robe lined with deep purple, longing. Part of the seduction game was guessing someone's mood by the colour of their silk. One courtier famously showed up to a moon viewing party wearing all white, mourning colours, because his lover had chosen another. He didn't say a word all night, just sat by the water sipping sake, being the drama. But the most famous and debated piece of erotic history from the Heian period is the practice of imperial night visits. These were exactly what they sound like. High-ranking men, including the emperor himself, would enter sleeping chambers of noble women, sometimes invited, sometimes less so. The morning after protocol involved a farewell poem left near the pillow, and, if the woman wished, a reply sent later that day. These encounters were steeped in courtly elegance, but they also walk a murky line by modern standards. Were they consensual? It's complicated. In Heian Japan, the balance of power was often masked by poetry, but that didn't erase the imbalance. There are passages in the Pillow Book and its more sultry cousin, The Tale of Genji by Murasaki Shikibu, that describe erotic encounters with emotional precision so vivid it feels intrusive. Genji, the fictional prince in Murasaki's epic, seduces women across the social spectrum, sometimes with tenderness, sometimes with eerie detachment. And while scholars have long debated how much Genji reflects real Heian behaviour, it's clear the court was obsessed with the performance of intimacy. Every encounter was staged, clothing, time of night, scent of incense. Even the sound of approaching footsteps on wooden floors had to be just right. Here's where it gets fascinating. The Heian period is considered a golden age of Japanese literature and feminine authorship. Women weren't just subjects of erotic narratives, they wrote them. They preserved their desires, frustrations and triumphs in diaries and monogatari that circulated quietly among the court elite. These writings were brutally honest. Seishonagon once described a man's scent as like incense that had been left too near something rotten. Another court lady wrote of a prince who recited poetry too quickly during lovemaking, ruining the moment like a flute played in a burning house. Open scholarly debate. Were the women of the Heian court oppressed or empowered? No, they were cloistered, expected to marry advantageously, and reduced to aesthetic prizes. Others say that through writing, coded robes, and the structure of night visits, they carved out a space of agency. A woman could reject a suitor by returning a poem unread. She could sabotage his status with a sharp verse circulated among ladies in waiting. In a world where social capital was built on whispers and impressions, women held subtle power and they knew exactly how to use it. Of course, all golden ages tarnish. By the end of the Heian era, military clans were rising and court life became more rigid. The subtle sensuality of layered robes and midnight verses gave way to stricter social structures, and eventually to the harsh displateau of samurai rule. But the records remain. The fans, the poems, the longing, and the lesson that even in a world wrapped in formality and silence, desire always finds a voice, whether it's in the rustle of silk, a drop of ink, or the soft sigh of a man who exits a bedroom too early, leaving only his perfume and a mediocre haiku behind. Tonight, you step into a world behind curtains, literally. Thick brocade curtains, gold-threaded veils, and latticed screens that divide power from desire, women from the world, and whispers from history. Welcome to the Ottoman Empire, and more specifically, to its most infamous institution of both political manoeuvring and sensual power, the imperial harem. This is not the fantasyland Western artists love to paint. No fountains and lounging women in sheer garments sipping sherbet. The real harem was far more complex, competitive, and yes, erotically charged. But not in the way you've been told. At its peak in the 16th and 17th centuries, the harem was not just the Sultan's private collection of concubines. It was an elite school, a political machine, a grooming ground for mothers of future rulers. And in this secretive world of silk and surveillance, women learned to wield power through strategy, loyalty, and intimate performance. Pleasure wasn't just pleasure, it was leverage, and no one understood that better than the sultans themselves. Take Suleiman the Magnificent, whose rule in the 1500s marked the golden age of Ottoman expansion, law, and, unironically, harem revolution. Suleiman broke centuries of custom by falling deeply, obsessively in love with a concubine named Roxolana, later known as Hurrem Sultan. She wasn't from noble stock, she was a Ukrainian girl captured in a raid, converted to Islam and brought to the harem. But within a few years, she'd risen to become Suleiman's legal wife, a shock to the empire, and the most powerful woman in the palace. Hurrem didn't just share his bed, she shared his policy decisions. She wrote letters, advised on diplomatic appointments, and, according to legend, kept a small notebook of all the women who tried to seduce him behind her back. The punishment? Not execution, not exile, just silence. She'd erase their names from daily life. Their rooms were cleared out overnight. Their names struck from the rolls. That's a very specific kind of revenge, intimacy weaponized with precision. Now, here's your fringe fact. The harem wasn't just female. In fact, the entire structure relied on eunuchs, particularly the black eunuchs, many of whom had risen to extreme power. The chief black eunuch, or Kuzlar Asa, controlled access to the Sultan, oversaw the women's education, and monitored alliances. These eunuchs weren't just guards, they were gatekeepers of influence, and some even managed covert marriages between favoured concubines and high officials, using pillow talk as political currency. But let's not ignore the erotic tension that underpinned the system. Every concubine in the harem was trained in the arts of seduction. But it wasn't just about sex, it was about presentation. Girls were taught calligraphy, music, poetry, even astronomy. Why? Because the Sultan didn't want a sex doll, he wanted a performer. Someone who could hold his attention during the long, brocaded hours between wars. There were no guarantees. You might wait years for your night with the Sultan, and once it came, you had one chance. If he wasn't impressed, you were shuffled into a corner of the harem and left to fade into middle-age anonymity, teaching newcomers how to wear perfume and walk without noise. The women who succeeded, who bore sons, who earned affection, were elevated to extraordinary status. The valid sultan, or sultan's mother, often became the most powerful figure in the empire after her son. She controlled appointments, gifts, and even diplomacy. Some ruled in all but name. In fact, the 17th century was known as the Sultanate of Women, when harem women essentially ran the empire from behind those veils. And if you think they didn't know exactly how to use their intimate positions to gather intel, influence alliances, or ensure a rival concubine accidentally spilled rosewater on a priceless carpet during a meeting with the Grand Vizier, well, bless your heart. Open scholarly debate. Was the harem a gilded prison or a crucible of feminine power? Orientalist narratives love to paint it as oppressive, a soft-lit jail for beautiful captives. But Ottoman historians increasingly view it as a sophisticated system. Women were trained, elevated, and embedded within the empire's elite political machinery. That doesn't mean it wasn't claustrophobic, emotionally brutal, or deeply unfair, but it also wasn't the passive, decorative zone the West imagined. And here's the part that still shocks: the golden cage. When a prince was born to a concubine, he wasn't celebrated and set loose. He was, quite literally, locked away. A designated palace wing called the kafes, or cage, housed the sultan's potential heirs. Why? Because succession was bloody. In earlier centuries, sultans often executed their brothers to prevent civil war. The cage was an attempt to curb this violence by keeping the princes under surveillance, isolated and politically impotent. The side effect? Oh, these men often went mad. Or worse, when they did take power, they ruled like men who'd never experienced real life. Imagine this. You're the son of a concubine who seduced a king. You grow up in gilded confinement with dancers and scholars whispering through screens. You're taught court etiquette but never allowed outside. You can smell the incense burning in the harem garden but never touch the flowers. Your mother tells you stories of how she outwitted rivals with a single glance. And when your time comes to rule, you've only known power through stand-and shadow and seduction. That's the legacy of the harem. Not just a place of erotic mystery, but of generational control, where bodies were used to shape empires, and every sigh, every glance, every curtain drawn or left open was calculated. Pleasure was never just pleasure. It was a message, a move, a future. Even now, the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul keeps the harem quarters closed to most visitors. Those who do enter find tight halls, painted tiles, and a hush that feels heavier than history. You can almost hear the silk slippers, the whispered poems, the breath of women who ruled not with swords but with secrets. Now the silk curtains fall, The harem doors click shut behind you, and you step out into the dimming light of empires whose flames have flickered for centuries. Tonight, we reach the edge of our twisted tapestry, a long thread of kings and emperors, queens and warlords, all tangled in the same shimmering web. Power and pleasure, fear and fascination. And here, at the closing act, we gather up those loose strands and ask the question that haunts every legacy born of lust. What happens when perversion isn't just a flaw, but a feature of how kingdoms are built? Because by now you've seen the pattern. Every monarch we've visited, whether they ruled with fire, feathered masks, or tantric scrolls, wielded intimacy not as indulgence but as strategy. And that brings us to the final chapter of this journey, not to a specific king, but to the very idea of perversion as a tool of the state, a shadow throne built beside the golden one. And no dynasty illustrates this more dramatically than the strange, glimmering decline of empires undone not by swords but by secrets. Take the late Romanovs of Russia. By the time Nicholas II took the throne in 1894, Russia had already been simmering with unrest. But it wasn't just the politics that unsettled the people, it was the palace whispers. The young Tsarina Alexandra was entranced by a mystic named Rasputin, whose erotic influence on the royal family became a national scandal. He was said to possess a hypnotic, almost sexual power over both the empress and her ladies-in-waiting. Rumours flourished of orgies disguised as healing sessions, of perverse cleansings, of the soul through the body. Was it true? Maybe not, but perception mattered more than reality. The people didn't trust a throne whose chambers echoed with moans and miracles. It's not the only example. The fall of France's Ancien Regime wasn't helped by the flood of pornographic pamphlets depicting Marie Antoinette in every compromising position imaginable, sometimes with her husband, sometimes not, and often with women. The idea wasn't just to humiliate her, it was to delegitimize the monarchy. Perceived perversion became political poison, and once the dam broke, no revolution could resist the tide. But here's where it gets complicated. What we call perversion now, secret fetishes, erotic rituals, taboo liaisons, was often entirely normal in context. In ancient Assyria, kings held ceremonial sex acts as part of New Year's festivals. In Egypt, pharaohs were expected to masturbate into the Nile as a blessing for fertility. Even in medieval Europe, certain royal coronation rites included ritualized physical intimacy, veiled in allegory and incense. So was this perversion, or just power performance? And maybe that's the real through line. It's not about who liked what in bed, it's about who got to perform it and what that performance meant. Kings didn't just rule over lands, they ruled over bodies, often beginning with their own. Their sensual lives weren't separate from their political lives. They were tools of dominance, control, connection, and sometimes complete collapse. Let's not forget the monarchs who tried to suppress their desires and ended up exploding in other ways. Henry VIII turned his frustrated sexual obsessions into a literal religious schism, splitting England from the Catholic Church to get a divorce and chasing heir after heir through wife after wife. Meanwhile, Charles II of Spain, so physically and genetically deformed by generations of incest, reportedly couldn't consummate his marriage at all, and yet his court was rife with whispered innuendo, compensating for his lack with perverse theatre and masked role-play among the nobility. When power fails to find satisfaction through love, it reaches for spectacle every time. Here's a fringe fact to tie the knot. Some royal courts in Europe and the Middle East trained official bedfellows, not lovers but watchers. These were chamberlains or eunuchs tasked with observing or recording royal intimacy, either to confirm legitimacy of heirs or to verify ritual performance. Their job? Not to stop the act, just to make sure it happened. Imagine your worst night, with a guy in the corner holding a ledger. Open scholarly debate time. Is history full of perverted kings, or is perversion just a retroactive label we slap on behaviours that made us uncomfortable? What counts as immoral in one century is sacred in another? That swan-obsessed king in Bavaria? Tragic gay icon or deluded narcissist? That woman who seduced her way into power? Manipulative temptress or survivor in a rigged game? Every generation rewrites the line between scandal and strategy. And that's what makes this journey so deliciously human. These rulers weren't robots. They were fragile, flawed, hungry creatures, just like everyone else. But they had the means to turn their fantasies into law, their bedrooms into thrones, and their shame into performance art. Some succeeded, some fell spectacularly, but all of them remind you that desire doesn't sit quietly in the corner of history, it dances at the centre, dressed in silk, wearing a crown. So what happens when desire rules the world? You get empires founded on foreplay, kingdoms collapsing over corsets, a parade of bodies marching beside banners, each movement as meaningful as a military order. You get kings who rewrite scripture to match their cravings, queens who build legacies out of longing, courts that whisper secrets in the dark, hoping no one listens, and praying someone does. Because history isn't just written in ink, it's etched into the curve of a spine, the tilt of a crown, the last kiss before exile. And in that breathless moment before a dynasty ends, you can always find someone, somewhere, clutching silk sheets and whispering, "I was born to rule." And now the torches have burned down, the velvet curtains have fallen, the whispered confessions and candlelit excesses of emperors and kings have faded into stone, scroll and rumour. You've wandered through centuries of lust-drenched power, where every crown bore the weight of desire, and every throne had a secret drawer or two, full of velvet rope, hidden scripts, or gold-laced regrets. Strange, isn't it? How the human need to control and to be desired pulses through history like a second heartbeat beneath the pageantry. We like to imagine kings as figures of ultimate command, but in truth they were often just as helpless before their passions as anyone else, except with better tailoring and significantly worse impulse control. Some chased transcendence through tantric ecstasy. Others drowned their kingdoms in erotic pageantry, erotic punishments, or love letters carved into marble. And many too many were just lonely people with too much power, and no one brave enough to tell them, "Hey, maybe don't throw a candlelit orgy next to the sacred altar tonight." But that's what makes history human. Not the battles, not the treaties. It's the hearts pounding in shadowed corridors, the lust written between lines of royal decrees, the soft moans buried beneath layers of silk and gold leaf. We don't remember these rulers for their tax reforms. We remember them for the way they craved, the way they broke, and sometimes the way they brought whole nations to their knees with a whisper. So tonight, as the story fades and your eyelids grow heavier, remember, history doesn't sleep. It lingers, breathless, waiting just behind the curtain. Sweet dreams, kings and queens.